Chapter 131. The man's voice was hoarse and seductive. Jinwon could barely stand it. Furthermore, right now, he was in such extreme torment. Jinwon thought he was embarrassed. She had already thrown caution to the wind. What was there to be embarrassed about? She reached out to tug on the belt hidden under his shirt. Mo Jingshan abruptly pressed down on her hand. His gaze was heavy and filled with indescribable darkness and profoundness as he stared at this little woman who did not know life from death. The surveillance cameras have blind spots. Let's find a corner where the cameras can't capture us. Jinwon did not wish to see him suffer so silently. She took the initiative to look back at the bathroom and several places around the bathtub. Here, after the lights are turned off, there's also the door. It definitely won't capture us. As she spoke, she took a step back toward the bathroom door. Her hand was still tightly gripping the corner of his shirt, preventing him from moving away. The moment Jinwon hid behind the door, Mo Jingshan sighed softly. He did not allow her to undo his belt, but instead held her wrist, leaning down to kiss her harshly on the lips. The kiss was deep and heavy, as though he wanted to skin her alive. In the end, he forcefully pressed down Jinwon's disobedient hand that was moving back and forth on his body. He gave a low muffled snort, speaking through gritted teeth. "Do you want me to die?" Jinwon's hand was restrained by him, and could not move. She could only stare at him helplessly, and say with incomparable sincerity, "It's just using my hand. I really know how to do it. In the past Xiatian, and I secretly watched that kind of movie." Seeing Mo Jingshan's raised brows, Jinwon immediately revealed an excited expression. "It's rare for me to have such an active opportunity. Don't you cherish it?" "Of course I have to cherish it." Mo Jingshan chuckled softly but still held her wrist. "Although the wound on your palm is not deep, it was scratched by those metal edges when you climbed up. This kind of injury requires a tetanus shot. Now that you've been soaked in the rain, it's already red and swollen." As he spoke, he comforted her, gently kissing her forehead. "I can't take the risk of letting your wound get infected. It'll be over after one night. It's all right." At this moment, Jinwon deeply regretted that she had prepared everything else, but forgot to prepare a pair of anti-abrasion and scratch-resistant rubber gloves when climbing up. She looked at her red and swollen palms for a while, and from time to time, some blood would flow out from the thin wounds. She sat there with furrowed brows. Mo Jingshan thought she was thinking about the wound on her palm, but in the next moment, Jinwon's words almost caused the composure he had maintained for more than 20 years to collapse. "How about I try it with my mouth?" Seeing that the man suddenly fell silent, Jinwon actually felt a little embarrassed. After all, she had seen a lot of big movies in the next 10 years. Although she had never done it before, she was not too unfamiliar with it. "Then, I'll go turn off the bathroom lights." Jinwon stood up, and was about to walk around the man in front of her, to turn off the lights outside the bathroom. However, the moment she got up, her wrist suddenly tightened. The man pressed her against the wall, and buried his burning face in her neck. He hugged her tightly, and said in an unbelievably hoarse voice, "If you really want to try, I'll give you the chance anytime after we leave this place." Jinwon's face instantly flushed red. "Who said I wanted to try? I just saw that you were in too much pain." Mo Jingshan chuckled hoarsely, hugging her. "There's no need. Just hold me like this. Stand here and don't move." "Are you sure that just a hug is enough?" His voice was still low and hoarse. "But I feel like you're in a lot of pain." He did not speak again, hugging her tightly. Jinwon leaned against the wall, allowing the man's tense body to press against hers. There was no gap between their bodies, and his body temperature gradually warmed her up. Jinwon obediently raised her hands to hug his back, pressing her face against his chest. She closed her eyes, and listened to the man's heart, that was not as steady and calm as usual. But even so, even though Mo Jingshan's short black hair was slightly messy, he was still incomparably handsome. Even though his shirt and pants were half soaked by her, he still possessed his unique charm of calmness and self-control. In comparison, Jinwon, who had climbed up from the 30th floor with no regard for her life, was completely soaked. There were still some traces of blood on her clothes, and there were small red marks on her face. She looked unbelievably wretched. She did not expect that even at this stage, she was still more wretched than him. They hugged for a long time. So long that Jinwon felt as though she was about to be burned by the heat of his embrace. She had only just begun to relax for the night when she leaned against his chest and almost fell asleep. All of a sudden, the man said in a low and hoarse voice, "Go out first. Let me take a shower." Jinwon opened her eyes. She was about to fall asleep, but she did not immediately wake up. She asked in a daze, "Is it cold water?" Jinwon nodded and cooperatively turned to walk out of the bathroom. In the end, a dry towel was suddenly tossed over her head. "It's not convenient to take off your clothes here. Your body is still wet. Wrap the towel around yourself." Jinwon nodded again, hugging the towel as she walked out. The consequence of relaxing was that she really wanted to sleep. She wrapped the towel around her body and subconsciously wanted to lie down on the bed or the sofa for a while. However, as soon as she got close to the bed, she saw the big bulge under the blanket, and the sleepiness in her head instantly disappeared. She composed herself and turned on the dim wall lamp at the head of the bed. She slowly reached out and lifted the quilt. Sure enough, she saw a young woman lying there quietly. Her breathing was steady, and she had been sleeping so peacefully in this situation. As expected, she had been drugged. Although he didn't know how long the woman on the bed was going to sleep for, her clothes were still intact, and there was nothing that shouldn't be exposed. The quilt was probably thrown over by Mo Jingshan, and even her face was not exposed. After all, she was a secretary of the Mo Corporation. If she had not had coffee with Shuyan, she would not have been sent to the big boss for no reason. After all, she was an innocent person. Jinwon gently covered her with the quilt again. Although her face was covered, she still left a gap at the edge of the quilt to prevent her from suffocating. Outside the window, the rain was still falling, but it was lighter than before, and the thunder was farther away. Jinwon stood by the window, looking at the sea not far away. Even now, she did not dare to look down from this angle. From the height of the 33rd floor, she could not even see the flower beds downstairs clearly. The passing cars were all fingernail-sized shadows. The word love was indeed a superstition of the right time and the right place. It would inexplicably give people fearless courage and even disregard life and death. Chapter 132. The few hours before daybreak were similarly torturous for Jinwon. The two of them slept on the sofa. Mo Jingshan held Jinwon in his arms. Jinwon slept soundly in his arms, but she could vaguely feel that his body was unusually hot. It was not until 4 or 5 in the morning when the sky gradually brightened. Jinwon slept and opened her eyes to look at the dark room. At the same time, she felt that Mo Jingshan had finally fallen asleep. Although his body temperature was slightly hotter than usual, it was not as severe as last night. He must have endured the most difficult part and finally fell asleep from exhaustion. Jinwon did not move as she leaned against his chest. She listened to his heartbeat and slowly raised her hands to hug his neck, closing her eyes. She did not know if the sleeping man had woken up, or if it was out of instinct, but he hugged Jinwon tighter. A gentle kiss landed on the top of her head. It appeared to be an unintentional kiss, but it caused Jinwon to uncontrollably smile in his arms. Jinwon slept for another 2 hours. When she opened her eyes, the sky had already brightened. She raised her head and saw that Mo Jingshan had finally fallen into a deeper sleep. His body temperature had also completely dropped. She released a sigh of relief and moved gently and slowly out of his embrace. She then picked up his coat and covered his body. She tiptoed to the bedside and pulled open the curtains. She looked at the color of the sky. Although there was a thunderstorm last night, the sun was shining brightly this morning. It seemed like it was already past 7 in the morning. At this moment, footsteps approached from outside the door. Jinwon vigilantly turned around. When she clearly heard that it was Elder Mo's voice, she directly walked to the door. "You sure hid Jingshan well. No wonder the people I sent out couldn't find the right place." Elder Mo angrily scolded as he walked by the door. "Brat, you can now be considered a schemer." Mo Xiao's voice rang from outside the door. "In front of father, I'm afraid I can't bear these words." Elder Mo coldly snorted. What you can't calculate is the human heart. Just this time, you still lost in the end. You sure are confident in Jing Shun's self-control. Since you insisted on coming here so early in the morning, I won't keep you in suspense. After this door is opened, you'd better face reality and let Xu Yan marry over. That way, I won't have to worry about this. Mo Xiao's tone was filled with certainty. Heh, Elder Mo chuckled. Then go ahead and try opening the door. Jin Wan leaned against the door and listened to the conversation outside. When she heard the brief sound of a room card being swiped, her brows furrowed, and she reached out to open the door from the inside. Mo Xiao's face originally had a hint of a cold smile. That kind of expression really matched Elder Mo's words. It had the flavor of a scheming and far-sighted person. However, the moment Jin Wan's figure abruptly appeared in the room, Mo Xiao's expression instantly stiffened. He quickly turned cold as he stared at her coldly. Why are you here? Jin Wan smiled at him coldly. Good morning, Chairman Mo. Mo Xiaoza glared at her with an ugly expression. He abruptly wanted to enter the door to check on the situation inside. But Jin Wan stood in front of the door and did not move aside. A man in his 50s, who was also Mo Jingshan's father, would not push her away. Elder Mo walked over with his walking stick, secretly giving Jin Wan a thumbs up. His eyes were filled with gratification and praise. He then calmly smiled at Mo Xiaoza, whose expression was extremely ugly. How is it? If I say you've lost, then you've lost. Your old man is still your old man after all. When it comes to the matter of my granddaughter-in-law, you can't waver. How did you find it? After all, Mo Xiaoza was someone who had seen wind and rain. After a moment his expression darkened, and he coldly questioned Jin Wan. Jin Wan smiled mildly. It doesn't matter how you found me. What's important is that I was with Jing Shen last night. Mo Xiaoza narrowed his eyes. Without waiting for him to speak, Elder Mo chimed in from the side. Gee brat, you've already married in for so long. Why are you still calling him Chairman Mo? Grandfather is here to support you. He's Jing Shen's father. It's time for you to change the way you address him. Mo Xiao's expression was still very dark. The scene he expected to see did not happen. Instead, he was beaten up by Elder Jin Wan this early in the morning. His face had been completely thrown away, and his gaze was dark and filled with anger. Jin Wan hesitated for a moment, but she still had to give grandfather Mo some face. She smiled slightly. Dad. Mo Xiaoza coldly watched her. I'm afraid I can't accept Miss Ji calling me Dad. If you want to call me that, then call me that. After all, you won't be able to call me that for long. Jin Wan smiled nonchalantly. She did not lose her composure because of the coldness and threat in his words. She continued to stand in front of the door, refusing to let him in. Putting aside the fact that the unconscious woman inside was innocent and could not be implicated or seen by him, Mo Jingshan had stayed up all night and finally fell asleep at daybreak. He should at least be allowed to sleep a little longer. Elder Mo glared at Mo Xiaoza with a displeased expression. Ji Brat has already given you enough face by calling you that. Can't you keep your stubborn temper in check? Jingshan's marriage is his own choice. Even if you're his father, you have no right to criticize him. This Ji Brat has long belonged to the Mo family. Besides, she's still a 20-year-old child. Can't you speak nicely to her? Do you have to be so unreasonable? Elder Mo continued. As the saying goes, it's better to tear down a temple than to ruin a marriage. You're not young anymore. After staying in America for so long, have you forgotten how to write the word respect? How can you be so overbearing? Jing Shun's future belongs to America and Shine, Mo Xiaoza coldly said. I don't wish to repeat myself. Xu Yan is the most suitable candidate. How isn't Xu Yan suitable? In terms of family background, Jin Wan is not much worse off than Xu Yan. It's just that the Ji family is in Haicheng. In the future, if Jing Shun returns to America to take over Shine, Jin Wan's position by his side might not necessarily be worse than in Xu Yan's. You haven't even compared them, and you're already denying Jin Wan. You're really a stubborn old man. Being scolded by his 80-year-old father as a stubborn old man. Mo Xiaoza's expression darkened. He then coldly stared at Jin Wan. Mo Xiaoza suddenly ordered the bodyguard behind him. Pull her away. The bodyguard immediately rushed forward. Elder Emo saw this and fiercely slammed his walking stick against the ground, angrily saying, "Who dares to touch my granddaughter-in-law?" Emo Xiaozi coldly stared at the elder, coldly ordering, "Are you all deaf? Pull this woman away." Enough. Suddenly, a clear voice rang from behind Jinwan. Chapter 133. Emo Jingshan stood there expressionlessly. His clear voice carried a biting chill. His gaze was cold and heavy as he indifferently glanced over. The two bodyguards who were about to reach out to pull Jinwan broke out in cold sweat under Emo Jingshan's intense gaze. They did not dare to touch her again, regardless of whether it was the room or the entire 33rd floor of the hotel. It was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. This was not the first time Jinwan had seen Emo Jingshan so cold, but his bone-chilling gaze still caused her to feel a chill down her spine. Emo Jingshan's gaze coldly swept past them. "Who dares to touch her?" "CEO Mo, we were just following Director Mo's orders. He was worried about your condition in the room, so he asked us to." The two bodyguards explained with trembling expressions. Emo Jingshan's gaze was sharp and cold. His gaze landed on one of them, and his lips curved into a mocking smile. Following orders? Jinwan stood by the door, silently standing there. From the start, she knew that Emo Xiaozi was completely unable to control Emo Jingshan. Otherwise, he would not have used such forceful methods. Sima Xiao's actions last night pushed Emo Jingshan further and further away. She could feel it from Emo Jingshan's current attitude. In his eyes, there was no longer this so-called father. Cold and chilling, Emo Jingshan approached Jinwan's side. He lowered his gaze to look at her small face that did not have the slightest hint of fear, and held her hand. Seeing Emo Jingshan's actions as he approached the door, Emo Xiaozi's expression instantly turned cold. His eyes were filled with displeasure. Jinwan thought that Emo Jingshan was using this method to appease her. She gently moved the hand he was holding, her fingers scraping against his palm in an attempt to ease the overly tense atmosphere. However, in the next moment, she was suddenly pulled over by a force. Her entire body fell into Emo Jingshan's embrace, and she lost her footing. Emo Jingshan's strong arms held her like this, as though announcing his ownership of her. He calmly pressed her against his chest. Emo Jingshan's cold and firm voice brushed past her head. "Jinwan is my wife. With me around, no one can shake her identity as Mrs. Emo." Emo Xiaozi's gaze was cold. "Where is Xu Yan? She wasn't with you last night?" At this moment, a gentle voice came from the elevator not far away. "Uncle Emo, I'm very sorry." Emo Xiaozi suddenly turned around and looked at Xu Yan. The answer was self-evident. Emo Xiaozi's gaze was dark and ruthless. His sharp eyes narrowed. "It seems like Xu Yan doesn't wish to use such a method to force others against their will. I can understand her hesitation. She's such a good woman who always thinks for you. Even at this stage, she would still give up on this opportunity. It can be seen how deep her feelings for you are. Jingshan, you better watch carefully. I saw it very clearly." Emo Jingshan's tone carried a hint of mockery. "I won't divorce her, and I won't marry Xu Yan. I'll only marry one Jinwan in my life. That's enough." And Xu Yan stood in the distance and did not approach. Although Emo Jingshan's voice was cold and light, and the pitch was not high, it was enough for her to hear it clearly from this distance. She lowered her eyes and did not speak again. A trace of bitterness flashed past the corner of her eyes. Last night, during the lightning and thunder, when Jinwan drove out of the Emo family home alone, she should have known. From Jinwan's unwavering trust in Emo Jingshan's gaze, she should have known. Emo Xiaozi's expression was heavy, cold, and sullen. He then turned to look at Xu Yan's dispirited and quiet appearance, and narrowed his eyes sharply and coldly. And Xu Yan politely nodded at him, and turned to leave. She did not wish to stand here and listen any further. Emo Xiaozi abruptly turned to look at Jinwan, his eyes cold. "Jingshan, so what if you care about this Jinwan? Women are just accessories to your career. If not for the Emo family's power, how could Jinwan, who was said to have her eyes on the top of her head, be willing to get married at the age of 20? Before the two of you got married, I'm afraid she didn't even know what kind of person you were. As for now, I'm afraid she still doesn't know." Bullsh**t. Elder Emo suddenly scolded from the side. Women are accessories to your career. If you have the ability, say the same thing to Jing Shun's mother when you return to America. Mo Xiaozi furrowed his brows, coldly glancing at the elder. It was clear that he was unhappy that he was everywhere. What are you glaring at? Decades ago, if it weren't for your old man's sharp eyes that allowed you to carry the beauty home, would you have been able to marry Jing Shun's mother? Back then, she was also a young lady with her eyes on the top of her head. From the start, she did not even have any interest in a bad-tempered brat like you. In the end, didn't the two of you live happily ever after? You even gave birth to such a good grandson like Jing Shun. Mo Xiaozi's chest was trembling with anger. Right now, he could not be bothered to argue with the elder. He only coldly glanced at Jin Wan. Why aren't you answering? Do you understand Jing Shun's past? Do you know what kind of person he is? Mo Jingshan's expression was very indifferent as he pulled Jin Wan behind him. Jin Wan suddenly chuckled lightly and walked out from behind him. She raised her eyes to look at Mo Xiaozi. Does Jing Shun's mother know how old you were when you were weaned? Does she know how old you were when you stopped wetting the bed? Does she know how many teeth you lost when you were 7? Does she know how you held hands and kissed a certain young lady the first time you fell in love with her? Does she know what kind of person you were before you got married? Mo Xiaozi's expression was dark and cold. He immediately glared at her angrily. She definitely doesn't know. Jin Wan maintained a smile on her face, but her lips were cold. Her eyes were clear and bright. She did not avoid his gaze in the slightest as she met his cold and ruthless gaze. Since she doesn't even understand your past, I think you can get a divorce at your age. Right now, it's very popular for old to marry the outstanding and Xuyan. Isn't that what you want? You're impudent. Mo Xiaozi abruptly scolded harshly. You're still young, but your temper is so fierce. Is this how your Ji family teaches you to be disrespectful to your elders? As your daughter-in-law, I can't even call you dad. This is already a great disrespect to you. Are you lacking a few more words of disrespect? Jin Wan retorted. That's right. Elder Mo almost wanted to stand by Jin Wan's side and give her a round of applause. Mo Xiaozi angrily closed his eyes. He pointed at Jin Wan and then looked at the smiling elder. This is the granddaughter-in-law you chose? Elder Mo nodded repeatedly, his face full of smiles. That's right, the granddaughter-in-law I chose. Mo Xiaozi. Chapter 134. Very good. Mo Xiaozi was enraged. I want to see just what abilities this Jin Wan has to make everyone in the Mo family favor her so much. She doesn't need any abilities. As long as she's Jin Wan, that's enough. Mo Jingshan calmly replied. Elder Mo chimed in. Just as well. This old man also wants to see what abilities An Shuyan has, to be able to force you to use such methods against your own son. Elder Mo glared at Mo Xiaozi, whose expression had darkened. Everyone has their own preferences. You like An Shuyan's radish, yet you insist on forcing her into Jing Shun's vegetable pit. Everyone is an individual with their own preferences. As long as Jing Shun likes it, as long as the two of them live peacefully, you shouldn't let anyone interfere between them. To think that you're Jing Shun's father. Mo Xiaozi coldly smiled. For someone like Jin Wan who doesn't respect her elders, don't expect me to accept her in this lifetime. If you can treat her like a daughter-in-law, Jin Wan will naturally show respect to her elders. Mo Jingshan's voice did not have any warmth. This is the most basic form of balance and respect between people. Elder Mo nodded. That's right. Humans are mutual. To nitpick unilaterally, this isn't the attitude of an elder. It's unreasonable. Mo Xiaozi's expression darkened. He fiercely glared at the two bodyguards standing by the door who did not dare to move. He wanted to scold them for being useless. They did not even know when Jin Wan entered the room last night. However, he was so angry that he did not want to speak anymore. With a dark expression, he turned and left. Mo Xiaozi directly flung his sleeves and left. No one stopped him. The floor returned to silence. Elder Mo looked toward Mo Jingshan, his tone kind. Jing Shun, were you all right last night? I was fine. I've made you worry. Mo Jingshan smiled mildly. The elder nodded. Your father's temper has always been like this since he was young. Since last night's matter did not succeed, I'm afraid that old face of his won't be able to hold on for more than a few days. As long as there are no misunderstandings between you and this G-brat, it'll be fine. Grandpa, don't worry. I'm sober. Jinwon winked at the old man. Yo, now you're happy. Yesterday, you locked yourself in Jingshun's room, hugging a pillow and curling up on the bed. And now you're gone? The elder laughed at her. Jinwon's face heated up. Grandfather, you're actually teasing me. Elder Emo laughed heartily. I won't laugh. Ha ha ha. The elder smiled and looked at Emo Jingshun with a red face. Jingshun, you'd better keep a close eye on this wife of yours. You're not allowed to lose her. If you dare to let her down, this old man will break your legs. Jinwon saw the old man raise his cane and instinctively moved closer to Emo Jingshun. Emo Jingshun chuckled, pulling the little woman who had subconsciously blocked his way behind him. His clear voice was like a flowing stream. I know. Elder Emo finally harumphed in satisfaction. His gaze shifted to Jinwon. How on earth did you sneak in last night? Jinwon winked at the elder and smiled. It's a secret. Little thing. You're still keeping your grandfather in suspense. All right. You probably didn't sleep well last night. Hurry back and rest. As for Jingshun's father, I have to think of a way to calm him down. As Elder Emo spoke, he walked out step by step with the support of his cane. As he walked, he muttered, Xiaozhe has been in America for so many years. Standing on top of power, he's used to ordering his subordinates around. Everything has to be done according to his arrangements. His desire to control is too strong. I think he's tired of sitting in this position. Jinwon returned to the room on the 30th floor and took out the bag she had left here last night. She then called someone to secretly send the innocent female secretary back. She put down her phone and raised her eyes to see Emo Jingshun standing by the window of her room. The floor-to-ceiling windows were not open. He stood there, his gaze peering out at the balcony. Jinwon walked over and gently reached out to hug his waist from behind. She pressed her face against his back and breathed in the scent of his body that was like morning dew. She felt that his body temperature had returned to normal and rubbed her face against his back with a smile. I don't want to come to this hotel ever again. You didn't sleep well last night. Let's change places. You need to rest, she said against his back. The hands that had reached out to his chest were held by him. Emo Jingshun's gaze was still fixed on the balcony outside. From the 30th floor, he overlooked the boundless sea. Outside the window, the autumn wind blew past, causing the trees below to sway. He did not speak, only pressing her hands against his body and holding them gently. It was very gentle and warm. The room was quiet for a long time. Jinwon decided to act spoiled as she circled around to his front. She pressed against his chest and raised her head. I know it was my fault for taking such a risk last night. I promise next time I'll definitely. There won't be a next time, Emo Jingshun finally spoke. However, he lowered his eyes, and the seriousness in his gaze entered her eyes. All right, there won't be a next time. Jinwon raised her hand and made an expression as though she was swearing to the heavens. I'll never climb such a high building again. I promise. Emo Jingshun continued to look at her coldly. Jinwon tugged on his collar to lower his head. She kissed his chin twice and continued acting spoiled as she said, I promise. Don't be angry. If I had waited at home last night, I'm afraid I would have stayed up until my hair turned white. It's also good like this. Emo Jingshun's hand pinched her face. He touched the faint red mark on her face from last night. His warm fingers gently caressed it. His brows were deep and calm as he stared at her, as though he was looking into the depths of her soul. Jinwon's mind was shaken by his gaze. However, she remembered that this hotel was not suitable for them to stay for long, and was about to move away from his embrace. However, the man's arms suddenly tightened around her. He stared into her eyes and kissed her. You don't dirty. Jinwon rushed to move her face away. I haven't showered properly since yesterday. When I woke up, I didn't wash my face or brush my teeth. I'm definitely dirty. Don't kiss me. However, before she could finish her words, her face was abruptly turned back by him. The man's hand supported her face, preventing her from moving away. When he kissed her again, he pushed her teeth apart and kissed her deeply. There was no room for her to dodge at all. She opened her eyes to look at him. In the next instant, the man pressed her against the wall by the window. Because Jinwon did not brush her teeth in the morning, she did not even dare to open her mouth. Her entire body was stiff and unwilling to cooperate. However, his hands were like vines that wrapped tighter and tighter around her. It was as though he wanted to press her into his body and become one with her. Chapter 135. When they finally left the hotel and sat in the car, Jinwon felt both her body and mind relaxed. You didn't rest well last night and were drenched in the rain. Go back and have a good sleep. Emo Jingshin's hand caressed Jinwon's head. Are we heading back to the U Garden? Hearing the words U Garden, Jinwon's expression clearly changed. Without needing her to say anything, Emo Jingshin could see the flash of hesitation in her eyes. Don't worry. In order to restrict my freedom, he used the method of kidnapping you to threaten me. The helpers in the U Garden were all sent away by him. No one was harmed. The man's voice was mild and quiet, but it caused Jinwon's heavy heart to finally fall to the ground. Thankfully, nothing happened to Auntie Chun and the rest. The security in the U Garden is so perfect. If Auntie Chun hadn't opened the door, those people wouldn't have had the chance to sneak in, right? Jinwon asked. Emo Jingshin glanced at her, holding her small hand. Forget it. Come back to the company with me. Otherwise, you won't be able to sleep well after you return. That won't happen. I'm just wondering how those people managed to sneak into the U Garden. Jinwon was deep in thought. Could it be that back then, Director Emo personally went to the U Garden? If he hadn't gone personally, Auntie Chun wouldn't have opened the door. Emo Jingshin's tone was calm. This matter can't be blamed on her. I won't do anything to her. Relax. Her thoughts were seen through again. This man was really scary. Jinwon grinned. It's not her fault in the first place. It's fine as long as you don't shift the blame to Auntie Chun. If you want to protect Auntie Chun, just say it. Emo Jingshin glanced at her, his low voice escaping from his throat. Today, come back to the company with me. When I have a meeting, the break room in the office is yours. Jinwon was quite excited to be able to sleep in his break room openly. However, she pretended to be innocent as she asked, Will I disturb you there? Speaking of which, Emo Jingshin understood her better than she had imagined. He knew that she did not want to return to the U Garden right now. If she returned to Aolan International alone, she would not be able to sleep well. Emo Jingshin's handsome brows rose slightly. How can I disturb you when I'm sleeping? Are you going to take off your clothes and run into my arms when you're sleepwalking? Jinwon pursed her lips. This was probably what Great Boss Missouri wanted to see her sleepwalking, right? If you don't mind the eyes of the other people in the conference room, I certainly don't mind giving it a try. Jinwon had always been good at talking. She would never lose out in a verbal argument. The man's hand around her waist tightened, and his voice was close to her ear. After last night, Mrs. Mo's knowledge in this area has really made me look at you in a new light. There's no hurry to get into my arms in the conference room. As for the other requests you mentioned last night, I can satisfy them tonight. Emo Jingshin's seductive and gentle voice pressed against her ears. His fingers seemed to touch her lips. The needs she mentioned last night. It went without saying. Jinwon's thick skin instantly reached the boiling point. She raised her hand and slapped his hand away. I don't need it. Previously, I only wanted to help you out of desperation. Now it's too late. Jinwon opened her mouth and bit down hard when his fingertip entered her lips. The man chuckled softly. Thinking of being shy now, isn't it too late? Jinwon angrily bit down on his finger again. She then felt that this action was too lustful and immediately pushed his hand away. She turned to look out the window and composed herself. However, she realized that Emo Jingshin's laughter was really pleasant to listen to. His voice was by her ear. It was as though warmth was slowly enveloping her from behind. It was slightly husky, magnetic, and mild. It was as though gravity was pulling her closer with every passing second. Emo Corporation. Emo Jingshin did not rest for a moment. By the time he arrived at the company, it was already past 10 in the morning. He immediately headed for a meeting. Jinwon's heart ached for his torment last night. However, she knew that he had always been a strict and serious person when it came to work. She did not disturb him. Knowing that he knew his limits, she returned to his office. Today in the conference room, all the executives found that CEO Mo's mental state was slightly more tired than usual. Although it was not obvious, they could still see it. However, even so, CEO Mo appeared to be in a good mood. There was less of his usual coldness and sternness. Even when he was listening to the reports from the various departments, there was a hint of gentleness on his lips. All the executives were shocked. After all, in this report, there were problems with 2 departments. CEO Mo's attitude right now. They did not know if it was the calm before the storm, or if something had happened. It was rare for CEO Mo to be so amiable in the company. When the meeting ended, the executives filed out of the conference room. Someone whispered, "CEO Mo seems to be in a good mood today? It's rare for a meeting to end so quickly. He's letting us go after just an hour? It should be because there's someone waiting for him in CEO Mo's office." Who? Which deity could make CEO Mo so easy to talk to? For the first time ever, he ended the weekly meeting half an hour early. It seems to be CEO Mo's wife. Shin-Mu was just about to head to the conference room to tidy up the documents. Seeing that CEO Mo had already come out, he rushed over. "CEO Mo, Secretariat has just sent an electronic resignation letter over. Should the resignation be submitted to the HR department, or should I directly approve it?" Shin-Mu asked softly. Mo Jingshin replied coldly, "Just approve it." "All right, I understand. Has Jin-Won eaten yet?" Mo Jingshin glanced at the time, asking in a heavy voice. Shin-Mu nodded. "Earlier at 11 o'clock p.m., I originally wanted to send someone to a nearby hotel to bring her a nutritious lunch. However, she said that she would be fine eating the company's staff meal. I followed her request and brought her lunch from the staff cafeteria. Right now, she should be almost done eating." "Staff meal?" Mo Jingshin's brows moved. He did not say more and directly entered the elevator. When they reached the office, Mo Jingshin pushed open the door. Inside the office, Jin-Won sat quietly on the sofa. In her hands was a disposable lunchbox. Inside was simple white rice and several vegetables and meat dishes. Although the Mo Corporation's staff meal was also nutritious, it was still too simple. It was even more common than ordinary home-cooked dishes. Looking at the lunchbox in her hands, and then at Jin-Won's satisfied expression, Mo Jingshin's usually calm eyes revealed a trace of gentleness. "How do you feel eating the staff meal?" Jin-Won was originally enjoying her meal, and did not notice the movements in front of the door. The moment she heard the voice, she subconsciously stood up. The lunchbox in her hands almost fell to the ground. Chapter 136. Hearing Jin-Won's evaluation, Mo Jingshin approached and stood before her. His gaze landed on the lunchbox by her side. Jin-Won pointed with her chopsticks. "Earlier, I asked Shin-Mu to bring another portion up. I planned to eat it after you returned from your meeting. I didn't expect your meeting to be so short today. It's perfect to eat it while it's hot. But be careful, it's still a little hot." Mo Jingshin watched Jin-Won, who sat on the sofa, and ate the simple employee meal with a satisfied expression. "Is it really that good?" he asked with a low chuckle. Jin-Won nodded seriously. No wonder so many people want to work for Mo Corporation. Even the quality of the employee meal is so good. It's clear that the other companies can't even hope to compare to our treatment in other aspects." She raised her eyes to look at him as she ate. The man was dressed in a black suit. The traces of dispiritedness from last night had faded away. He stood in the bright office, and was especially eye-catching and good-looking. Mo Jingshin picked up the lunchbox and sat by her side. He glanced at her eating manner and smiled faintly. He did not say anything, and sat there to accompany her to eat. The office door was tightly shut. Otherwise, anyone who saw this scene would be shocked to the point their jaws dropped. Mo Corporation's CEO boss did not discuss the hundreds of millions of US dollars in the afternoon. Instead, he sat lazily and calmly on the sofa in the office, accompanying Mrs. Mo to eat the employee meal. From time to time, he would bring her favorite stir-fried meat. As he did so, he said, "If you like it, ask Shin-Mu to bring you another portion." "There's no need. This is enough. If I continue eating like this, I'll really get fat. Even if I get fat, I want you." What are you afraid of? No, I'm already full. My stomach is about to burst. You don't want the shredded potatoes? Then I'll eat a few more bites. Do you want the fried tofu? After the meal, someone from the secretary's office called to say that a representative from a partner company wanted to meet CEO Mo. To avoid disturbing his work, Jinwon pushed open the door to the break room and entered. She had just taken a step in when she heard Mo Jingshan say from outside, "You were drenched in the rain last night. Take a hot shower and have a good sleep. I'll call you after I'm done." Jinwon raised her hand and made an okay gesture before entering the break room. She had been to the break room in his office before. It was when she came over to coax him back to the U Garden. After such a long time, Jinwon finally had the time to check on his break room. It was in the same minimalistic style as Aolon International with cool colors. Back then, grandfather Mo had been involved in the renovation of the U Garden. However, Aolon International and this break room clearly belonged to Mo Jingshan's style. Simple, low-key and plain. But because it was the place where Mo Jingshan used to live, the cold color made Jinwon feel inexplicably intimate and warm. Because she had been drenched last night, she only took a shower in the hotel bathroom and didn't take a good shower. Now her body and head were a little itchy, and she couldn't just lie on the bed to sleep. She opened the wardrobe to take one of Mo Jingshan's shirts as a change of clothes, and then take a shower. However, the moment the wardrobe door was opened, she was shocked to see that half of the space in Mo Jingshan's wardrobe was actually filled with women's clothes. They were all new. Thin, thick, long, short, inside, outside women's clothes. Jinwon took one out in shock and found that it was in her size. She then flipped through the others and found that they were all in her size. She found a thin shirt suitable for sleeping and held it in her arms. She knew that Mo Jingshan was busy in the office and couldn't go out to ask him, so she picked up her phone and sent him a message. "When did you prepare so many clothes for me in the wardrobe? I just opened the wardrobe. You gave me a fright." After sending the message, she waited for about a minute. Seeing that he didn't reply, she guessed that he was busy and went straight into the bathroom. After showering and drying her hair, she came out wearing the clothes Mo Jingshan had prepared for her. She carried the fragrant scent of shower gel and threw herself onto the large bed in the break room. She picked up her phone and saw the reply Mo Jingshan had sent her several minutes ago. "The day after that time you wore my shirt." Jinwon stared at the phone screen in surprise. She was sure he was talking about the day after. The day after? He moved so quickly. At that time, he clearly didn't plan on moving back to the master bedroom. Even though their relationship had improved, they weren't too intimate. Yet at that time, he had already made preparations that she would one day stay in his break room? Exactly how black-bellied was this man? Jinwon really wanted to reply, but considering that he was currently working, and that he clearly had work to do in the afternoon, she held it in and placed her phone down. She flipped over and lay on the bed, her eyes occasionally glancing at the wardrobe. Her hands were crossed in front of her chest, casually moving her fingers. However, her mind seemed to have flown into the clouds, giving her a surreal feeling. She picked up the phone by the pillow and looked at the 15 words and 2 punctuation marks he had just sent. After staring at it for a long time, she suddenly smiled and placed the phone down. She buried her face in the pillow and laughed. What should she do? Great Boss Mo's ability to tease her was becoming harder and harder to control. A few clothes and a message were enough to make her unable to calm down. Jinwon flipped over again, thinking that she wouldn't be able to sleep anymore. However, last night had been so thrilling, and her mental state was unable to take it. She closed her eyes and began to count sheep, forcing herself to sleep. 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep for sheep. 98 Mo Jingshans, 99 Mo Jingshans, 100 Mo Jingshans, 101 Mo Jingshans. Jinwon abruptly grabbed the pillow and pressed it against her head. Damn it, she couldn't sleep. The man outside was still focused on his work. Right now, her maiden heart was already stirred to the point where she couldn't sleep. Aha! In a certain staff office in the Mo Corporation, discussions were rife. I heard that Assistant Shin sent 2 sets of employee meals to the CEO's office today. Guess who those 2 sets of employee meals were for? It can't be Mrs. Mo, right? I heard that Mrs. Mo used to be the young miss of the famous Ji family in Haicheng. Since she was young, she ate all kinds of delicacies and high-end food. No matter how ordinary it was, it would definitely be prepared by a highly skilled helper or chef. She definitely wouldn't eat employee meals. That might not be the case. Our company's employee meals are clean and delicious. Even CEO Mo would occasionally eat them when he's especially busy. Mrs. Mo is also a person. It's not strange for her to eat employee meals with CEO Mo in the office. Impossible, she definitely wouldn't eat it. Do you want to make a bet? All of a sudden, Shinmu stood in front of the office door. He coughed and cleared his throat, speaking sternly. Why are you all standing together and discussing? Are you all done with your work? Aren't you all too free? In an instant, the employees scattered like birds, quickly leaving. Chapter 137. In the evening, it was almost time to knock off. Mo Corporation CEO's office. The business partners received a satisfactory contract and chatted politely for over 10 minutes before finally leaving. The office returned to silence. Mo Jingshan's gaze landed in the direction of the break room. After the secretary and assistant came in to report on the day's work, he glanced at the time and closed the documents in his hands. He stood up and walked to the door of the break room. It was very quiet inside. It could be seen that Jin Wan had indeed fallen asleep. The door to the break room was quietly pushed open. On the soft, large bed, Jin Wan slept soundly. Her soft, long hair covered the pillow, and her sleeping face was peaceful and peaceful. Her phone was placed by the pillow, within reach. It was as though he could see that she was still debating whether to pick up her phone to reply to his message before she fell asleep. Mo Jingshan smiled and picked up her phone, placing it on the bedside table. Jin Wan slept too soundly. Mo Jingshan sat down by the bed and watched her sleep. He did not move, and only watched her like this. In the stormy night, the little woman seemed to have descended from the sky, climbing up from the balcony, and rushing into his arms with a body full of injuries. The scene repeatedly replayed before his eyes. He stared at her for a long time. The red marks on Jin Wan's face had already faded to the point where they could no longer be seen. Mo Jingshan held one of her hands and turned it over. He looked at the wound on her palm. Although it was very small and not considered serious, because it had not been disinfected, the edges of the wound were slightly red. He stood up and walked out of the break room, calling Shenmu to buy some medicine. Not long after, Mo Jingshan received the medicine and returned to the break room. It was so quiet that there was not a single sound. He could only vaguely hear Jin Wan's light breathing as she slept. It had a gentle frequency, causing one to feel that this room was peaceful and quiet. The medicine that Mo Jingshan had Shenmu by was not as painful as disinfectant alcohol. However, when Jin Wan's palm was suddenly lightly sprinkled with the medicine, it still felt slightly itchy and painful due to the anti-inflammatory ingredients. Even though it was not obvious, she still furrowed her brows uneasily in her sleep. Ugh! She instinctively wanted to retract her hand and let out a soft moan in discomfort. Mo Jingshan held her hand and didn't let her draw it back. As Jin Wan struggled harder, he bent down and gently kissed her on the lips. Finally, because the numbness on her lips overwhelmed the slight itch and pain in her palm, her furrowed brows gradually relaxed, and she went back to sleep. Her cherry-colored lips curved into a faint smile as though she had a sweet dream. When the little woman slept, there was a special kind of sweet temptation. If it weren't for the fact that both his hands were occupied, and he had to continue applying medicine for her, Mo Jingshan would not mind pressing her under his body and kissing her harshly for a while longer. He slowly got up and gently held her hand. He slowly sprinkled white medicinal powder on the small wounds on her palm. The wounds weren't serious and didn't need to be wrapped with gauze, but the simple disinfection and anti-inflammatory process couldn't be neglected. Jin Wan's clothes were thin and loose. Mo Jingshan could easily pull her sleeves open and apply medicine on the wound on her arm. He then lifted the hem of her clothes. The man who was about to continue applying medicine on her leg paused for a moment. After showering, she had directly put on these clothes. There was nothing under the clothes, and the scenery under the clothes was completely exposed. Emo Jingshan suppressed the fire burning in his eyes. After applying medicine on the wound on her leg, he placed the medicine on the bedside cabinet. Then he lowered his eyes. He watched the little woman who instinctively curled up her legs, due to the slight coldness of the blanket being pulled aside, and the hem of her clothes. Last night, the two of them did not rest well. Originally, he should have let her sleep a little longer. However, this scene was too shocking. Emo Jingshan's extraordinary self-control, which he was able to maintain last night under the effects of the medicine, almost completely collapsed at this moment. He bent down and picked up a strand of her hair. The fragrance of the shampoo and shower gel mixed with the faint fragrance of her body. Emo Jingshan curved his lips, planting a kiss on her hair. He then tilted his head, planting a kiss on her fair and beautiful brows. Slowly, he moved down to her small and straight nose, and then slowly covered the soft lips that he had not kissed enough earlier. The warm, soft, and beautiful touch caused the man to feel a momentary sense of submission towards Gu Jingshan. His kiss gradually deepened. No matter how deep Jinwan's sleep was, she still opened her eyes. However, she was not fully awake. Her slightly dazed eyes saw the man above her. Seeing that it was Emo Jingshan who was kissing her, she did not resist. Taking advantage of the gap between their lips, she murmured with a smile, "Are you done with your work?" Emo Jingshan's movements did not stop. His palm had already touched the softness of her chest through her thin clothes. The kiss on her lips deepened, and his other hand held her waist. The man's kiss moved past her cheeks, lingered on her lips, and slowly moved down to her neck. Because Jinwan had actually fallen asleep under him, the man suddenly bit down on her collarbone, causing her to shiver. The moment she opened her eyes, she drowsily raised her hand to press her head. "What time is it?" She had just woken up and asked hoarsely. "It's already time to get off work." The man continued kissing her collarbone and neck, but this time, the kiss was more passionate and intense. His voice was as hoarse as hers. Jinwan was about to get up, but was unable to. Only then did she realize what Emo Jingshan was doing to her body. Her sleepiness was completely gone. Before she could speak, the man's hand had already reached under her clothes. His scorching palm caressed her back and moved up, pressing her entire body firmly into his embrace. Under her slightly surprised gaze, he held the back of her neck and kissed her harshly twice on the lips. "You're awake." "And I'm awake." Jinwan was startled. She realized that they were still in the break room beside his office, which meant that they were still in his company. She mumbled against his lips, "What are you doing?" "What do you think I'm doing?" He chuckled softly. In an instant, he kissed her until she almost forgot what night it was. Finally, the man's actions became more and more excessive. Jinwan was provoked into moaning softly, asking, "You didn't sleep much last night. Today, you came straight to the company. Is your body able to take it?" What she meant was that she was worried that he did not sleep well last night. After staying up late and working so hard, she wanted him to take this opportunity to have a good sleep. Chapter 138. What I mean is, before Jinwan could finish her words, Emo Jingshan's kiss was already hot and intense. He pried open her lips and invaded her teeth. This is the company, the office." Jinwan wanted to speak, but her words were choppy. Every word was swallowed by him. Even the places he kissed were more intense than before, causing her to tremble nonstop. Her neck, collarbone, shoulders, chest, and even further down. Jinwan was very sensitive, so sensitive that her entire body trembled from his teasing. Those kisses were filled with an even more passionate and infatuated flavor, causing one to be unable to extricate themselves. He tasted every inch of her, not letting go of a single trace of her sweetness. "Even if you're off work, there should still be people in your company." "Ugh. Don't. Let's go home first." "Not good." The man's resolute and decisive voice landed on her lips once more. Under Jinwan's nervous and embarrassed expression, he said, "Weren't you very powerful last night? Are you going to shrug it off today?" Jinwan narrowed her eyes at him. "Emo Jingshan, don't fail to appreciate my kindness. Yesterday, I was in." He suddenly kissed the softest and most sensitive spot behind her ear. She immediately moaned. and then she heard Mo Jingshan nibbling on her ear. His voice was rough and low, which he had been holding back for a long time. Last night, if it weren't for the surveillance cameras, I would have definitely done it until you couldn't say a single word. Jinwan, how could I let you go now? She clearly felt that the man could no longer restrain himself. His lower body was hot and dangerously pressing against her. Jinwan whimpered from his kiss, and didn't know where to place her hands for a moment. In the next instant, Mo Jingshan pulled up her hand from the bedsheets and pressed it against his body. Come, I'll satisfy you. His voice was low, and there was a hint of naughtiness in it. She suddenly shivered, and couldn't retract her hand no matter how hard she tried. The temperature of her hand was so hot that her whole body felt like it was burning. She blushed and turned her head away to avoid looking at him. This was the first time he had broken through the original boundaries. She could only blame herself for daring to say anything in a moment of desperation last night. Now, she finally suffered the consequences. In just a moment, her hands were sore and tired. However, because of the movements of her hands, Mo Jingshan planted numerous kisses on her shoulders and cheeks. I can't take it anymore. She was now annoyed by the emptiness. Just as she was about to retract her hand, her wrist was clasped by the man's palm. She kept trying to break free, but she was tightly controlled by him and pressed back again. Mo Jingshan. Jinwan's expression was angry, but her voice was hoarse and soft. The man sucked her earlobe and said hoarsely, continue. Jinwan wanted to cry, but no tears came out. The heat on her face was almost comparable to the heat in her palms. It was similarly scorching hot. The phone that Mo Jingshan had casually tossed onto the bedside suddenly vibrated at this moment. Go answer the phone first. Jinwan's voice was soft, and her eyes were moist and red. Although she did not want to cry, she was almost forced to. He really brought this upon himself. Why did she mention using her hands yesterday? Mo Jingshan glanced at her, before glancing at the phone on the bedside table. He saw that the caller was in Shuyan. He reached out to hang up, lowering his head to place a kiss on Jinwan's face. He chuckled softly. Your hands are sore? However, Jinwan turned to look at the phone on the bedside table. Who's calling? Why aren't you answering? Before she could finish speaking, his phone began vibrating again. This time, she paid attention and raised her head slightly to see the caller ID on his phone. It was still a string of numbers without a note. She recognized the numbers. It was actually in Shuyan. She called me twice in a row. Something must have happened, right? Mo Jingshan was expressionless as he calmly said. Her electronic resignation letter has already been submitted to the company. Shinmu will handle it. There's no need for me to handle it. Jinwan took the opportunity to move her hand up slightly, avoiding the man's heated gaze. She took the initiative to pass his phone to him. Then I'm even more curious. She's going to return to America soon, and has already taken the initiative to resign. What else can she talk to you about? Curious? Mo Jingshan's brows coldly furrowed. The phone gradually stopped vibrating. 10 seconds later, it rang again. Mo Jingshan saw Jinwan's insistence and stood up. At the same time, he pulled her up and pressed her into his embrace. He held her waist with one hand to prevent her from escaping, and used the other to pick up the phone. He pressed the speaker button. The moment the call connected, Mo Jingshan's tone was extremely calm. What's the matter? And Shuyan was silent for a moment. After a moment she softly said, COMO, I've just received my resignation letter. The speed was very fast. Did you approve it? The man was indifferent. It was Shinmu. The other side of the phone was silent for a long moment before Shuyan's slightly soft voice came through. You don't even plan on handling my resignation letter. You're really heartless and cold to people unrelated to you. Jinwan sat on his lap, watching the man's cold and indifferent face. Only now did she feel that the Mo Jingshan that others said was hard to approach was true. Mo Jingshan remained extremely cold. When you came, you didn't ask for my permission. When you leave, there's even less of a need to wait for my approval. And Shuyan instantly tightened her grip on the phone. What he meant was that her coming and going had nothing to do with him. From the start to the end, there was no need for her to leave a single trace at his place. This was indeed Mo Jingshan's style, and Shuyan calmed herself down and said, "What Uncle Mo means is that after we settle all the details of the cooperation with the Mo Corporation in China, we'll return to America next weekend. I'll go back with him, but before that my father and I will stay with him at the Mo family for a few days." Mo Jingshan did not speak, only calmly listening. "Also, my father has already planned on canceling my engagement with the Wilson family. That's your problem. There's no need to tell me." Mo Jingshan's attitude was extremely indifferent, and Shuyan sighed slightly. She clearly knew that he was unwilling to listen. After thinking for a moment, she still said what she wanted to say. "Previously, I heard the Ji family's second miss mention some things. She mentioned Jin Wan's recent changes. From some of the details, don't you think that Jin Wan is hiding something from you?" Jin Wan listened by the side. She slightly raised her brows, meeting Mo Jingshan's indifferent gaze. She smiled at him, suddenly leaning close to his ear. Using in Shuyan's tone, she softly said, "Don't you think that Jin Wan is hiding something from you?" Mo Jingshan chuckled softly and pinched the waist of the naughty woman in his arms. He was still cold and indifferent to the person on the other end of the phone. "This is my private matter. No one has the right to interfere or ask." Mo Jingshan directly hung up, tossing his phone to the side. He abruptly threw Jin Wan, who was mischievously causing trouble by his ear, onto the bed. His long legs blocked her thighs, leaning over and pressing down. Chapter 139. Jin Wan did not even have the chance to struggle or cry out. The man pressed her down on the bed and kissed her until she was out of breath. This was Mo Jingshan's resting room. His scent was everywhere. His open arms were enough to cover the sky. There was no way for her to escape. "What did you hide from me?" Mo Jingshan glanced at her, speaking in a low voice. At the same time, he tugged at the collar of his shirt. His movements were natural and casual, but in Jin Wan's eyes, it was extremely seductive. "I've actually hidden a lot from you. For example, pretending to love you every day. Only then can I gain your complete trust. Then one day, when the time is right, I'll poison you. And the Mo Corporation in your hands and shine in the future will belong to me." Jin Wan blinked at him as she spoke. She acted as though she was telling the truth. "Is that all you're capable of?" Mo Jingshan held her waist, pressing her against his lower body. Jin Wan felt some pain from the pressure. She raised her head to look at him, but before she could complain, he pressed her down again. The man's voice was clear and heavy. "Based on how infatuated I am with you, you can easily control my thoughts and actions. There's no need to poison me at all. Right now, Mo Corporation can be transferred to your name and owned by you. I'm all yours. Whatever you want, isn't it all just a matter of a single word?" "I'm joking." "I'm not joking." He looked at her. Jin Wan felt uncomfortable from the heat of his lower body. She tried to twist her body to avoid his dangerous resistance. "Continue." He gave a simple order. He pulled her hand down, watching her face that was once again filled with heat. He glanced at her bashful appearance. "Continue." She had already received a call, and she still wanted to continue. Jin Wan's evil thoughts of revenge rose. The moment her hand reached down, she suddenly used force. After Mo Jingshan let out a muffled groan, she paused. In an instant, it was as though she was inspired. She was finally willing to act like a serious beginner, learning from the video she had seen online. "Continue." Mo Jingshan's breathing became increasingly hurried. Just as Jin Wan seemed to have grasped his sensitive spot and began to exert more force, he held the back of her head with one hand, forcing her to raise her head. He pressed against her harshly and bent down to kiss her heavily on the lips. Jin Wan could even hear his slightly uncontrollable panting. His other hand suddenly slid down her back to the back of her waist, caressing and teasing every inch of her skin before pressing into his embrace. "I have indeed underestimated you." His voice was already tainted with a strong sense of lust. It was as difficult to restrain the strength and grace of his hand that was firmly pressed behind her head. Without giving Jin Wan any time to catch her breath, Jin Wan could only hear the crisp sound of the belt on his waist. She couldn't help but let out a low moan as her waist sunk in. Mo Jingshan's kiss left her neck. He raised his head and landed on her lips. His kiss was gentle and delicate. Jinwon was afraid that she would make a sound. After all, this place was right next to his office. She turned her head away and bit her lip harshly. He lifted a strand of hair that had fallen over her shoulder and tucked it behind her ear. Remember my words, What are you talking about? I'm yours. The man's low and heavy voice exploded in her mind. Jinwon abruptly opened her eyes and saw that in the depths of his eyes, only her reflection was imprinted. She was going to die. Was he using a big move on her? Jinwon was already about to overflow. Because of his gaze, she suddenly moaned softly and raised her hand to cover her face. Emo Jingshin chuckled lightly. He pulled her hand away and brought it to his lips for a kiss. Knock knock. There was a sudden knock on the door of the break room. When Jinwon heard the knock on the door, she immediately shivered and hurriedly tried to stop. But Emo Jingshin held her firmly and didn't let her escape. Emo Jingshin didn't let her escape. There's someone, she softly said in a hoarse voice. Shenmu, who was standing outside the door, had actually braced himself to come. After all, it was already time to get off work. He also knew that Jinwon was here. Right now, both CEO Emo and Jinwon were in the break room. Him knocking on this door was clearly an act of sending himself to death. However, Director Emo had suddenly come to inspect the company. Regardless of whether he was the chairman of Shine Group or CEO Mo's father, there was no way to stop him. CEO Emo, are you asleep? As Shenmu spoke, he felt his scalp turning numb. He felt that his little life was about to end. When Jinwon heard that it was Shenmu, she guessed that he had already guessed the situation inside. Her body was as tense as a drawn bow. She was so tense that she did not dare to move. Emo Jingshin also trembled because of her body's instinctive reaction due to her nervousness. He abruptly lowered his head and bit down on her fair shoulder, barely holding back the moan that almost escaped his lips. What followed next was like a reward and punishment. Not only did the man's actions not stop, they became even more violent and impudent. Yet, it was extremely comfortable. Jinwon glared at him and could not help but moan softly. Outside, could it be that they had already heard it? While she was worried, she was also stimulated to the point that her entire body was trembling. She clearly knew that this was not the right time to continue, yet she was willing to sink into it and be consigned to eternal damnation. Jinwon woke up from a slight jolt. She opened her eyes and discovered that she was in a limousine, separated from the driver's seat in front. Her memory paused at the moment when her mind was about to scatter. It was as though she could still remember the impudent act that surpassed her rationality. She abruptly turned her head, only to meet Emo Jingshin's deep and boundless gaze. Emo Jingshin, you really fainted at the right time. Jinwon completely did not expect that she would actually faint. At that time, she really could not gather her emotions. She could not remember how it ended, how she showered, or how she put on her clothes. She narrowed her eyes at him. In the future, I'll never go to your company again. Shenmu most likely already knew about it. Emo Jingshin chuckled hoarsely, rubbing her puffed-up face. We're husband and wife. What can he do even if he doesn't know? The man was still dressed in a well-fitted suit. This simple suit and shirt style might not look good on other men, but on Emo Jingshin, it gave off a refreshing feeling. It was surprisingly fitting and perfectly matched his cold, indifferent, yet well-mannered character. Back then, Shenmu suddenly came to the office to look for you. Did something happen? Jinwon did not wish to discuss the incident in the break room, and directly changed the topic. The people from Shine Group came to the company for a surprise inspection. They only arrived for half an hour before leaving. Emo Jingshin's hand slowly rubbed Jinwon's earlobe, a hint of a smile in his eyes. At that time, I had already carried you into the bathroom and soaked you in a daze. Chapter 140. Jinwon turned to look out, and found that they had arrived at the main gate of the U Garden. Emo Jingshin finally let go of her, helped her adjust the collar of her coat, opened the door, and motioned for her to get out of the car. Jinwon's hands and feet were sore from being tossed around by him. As soon as she opened the car door, she almost fell down. Fortunately, Emo Jingshin was behind her and reached out to support her. He quietly pressed her into his arms and glanced down at her. Receiving Jinwon's hateful glare, he immediately understood her situation, and the corners of his lips turned up in a triumphant smile. Previously she said she would do it, but now she couldn't say a word. He really did it. Jinwon rolled her eyes at him, steadied herself and walked inside. "Madam," Auntie Chin came out to welcome her. The moment she saw Jinwon, she immediately stood in front of the door with an apologetic expression. Her eyes were worried and apologetic. Seeing Auntie Chin's expression, Jinwon smiled at her and intimately held Auntie Chin's arm to say, "No matter what happened before, it's not your fault. Don't think too much. Look, I'm fine, aren't I?" In fact, Auntie Chin didn't know what had happened, but when she came back today, she checked the surveillance footage of the Yew Garden and saw the scene of Jinwon being taken away. Only then did she realize what a big mistake she had made yesterday. She actually opened the door and let in the people who could threaten Jinwon, and then she was sent out, causing Jinwon to be in danger after returning home alone. She really shouldn't have done that. Later, she called the Mo family, apologized to Elder Mo, and asked about the situation. After confirming that Jinwon was fine, she was reassured to wait at home. "I've seen the surveillance footage. At that time, it was clearly Director Mo who said he wanted to enter the Yew Garden to see where you and Mr. Mo live now. But in the surveillance footage, who on earth took you away?" Auntie Chin was still full of apology, holding Jinwon's hand with lingering fear, and kept asking, "It's all right. No matter who they are, I'm standing in front of you safe and sound." Jinwon patted her hand and asked with concern, "You called the Mo family, didn't you? Grandfather didn't blame you, did he?" Auntie Chin shook her head and looked at Jinwon with heartache. "Don't worry about us. Go in and sit for a while. You must not have had a good rest these days. You must be frightened, right? I'll make you some tranquilizer soup to calm your nerves." Jinwon pursed her lips into a smile and nodded. She turned to see that Mo Jingshan had already entered the door and rushed to follow him in. However, she saw that the man was standing in front of the television, his eyes dark as he watched the surveillance video that the helper had brought out. On the screen, he saw everything that happened after Jinwon returned home alone. Jinwon could feel the cold and stern emotions in his dark gaze. She stared at the image on the television for a long time. She walked over and placed her hand in his, saying, "At the time, those two people didn't want to hurt me. Later on, I was only sent to one of Director Mo's private villas in High City. Aside from locking me up, they didn't do anything to me. After that, Grandfather rushed over and took me away." After saying this, she asked the servant for the remote control and decisively turned off the TV. "It's true. That day, aside from being a little scared and worried about you, I wasn't hurt at all." Jinwon's warm and soft voice was close by his side. Her hand was still pressed against his palm. "Delete this surveillance video. Don't look at it anymore. If I made you feel the slightest bit scared, it was because I didn't do well enough." Mo Jingshan held her hand, his voice low and heavy. Jinwon dragged him back to the room. After entering the room, she hugged him and rubbed her face against his chest. She said softly, "You didn't do well enough. In this world, there's no man who treats me better than you. You haven't rested. Don't think about it. Sleep early tonight, okay?" The man lowered his head to look at her. His long and powerful fingers ran through her long hair, and his other hand wrapped around her waist, locking her in his embrace. Recalling the scene he had seen in the surveillance camera, he said in a low voice, "I'll sleep later. I'll accompany you for a while first." "I don't need to accompany you." He held her and sat on the edge of the bed. He pressed her head against his shoulder and snuggled up to her. Jinwon buried her head in his embrace. Previously, she thought that she would not be able to sleep well for several days after returning to the Yew Garden. However, after a moment, the shadow in her heart completely dissipated. In fact, as long as the Mo family did not come, even an unidentified fly would not be able to enter. There was no place safer than the Yew Garden. Mo Jingshan did not speak. She knew that his current mood was affected by the surveillance video earlier, and did not break the silence. She reached out to hold his hand, and gestured with her own hand in his palm. Time passed bit by bit. Seeing that Mo Jingshan still had no intention of sleeping, Jinwan began to find a topic to talk about while playing with his fingers. Do you really know a great deal about me before? She asked. Mo Jingshan glanced at her. Are you very curious about this? No, I don't have any dark cards up my sleeves that I'm afraid others will use against me. It's just that there are some things in the Ji family that I can't bring up to the surface. However, those are all things that I used to target my father and Auntie Shun. Jinwan leaned into his embrace. Then do you know that when I was a teenager, I studied in America for a few years? Although I wasn't particularly serious in my studies, I still managed to get all A's. If not for my good grades, I would have had to continue studying in America for a few more years. Perhaps I would have missed the opportunity to marry you. Mo Jingshan's gaze suddenly became very deep. He looked at her. When you were studying in America, I was also in America. The fate that should come will come sooner or later. I won't miss it. Based on what you're saying, do you think we've met before? Jinwan raised her head to look at him. Mo Jingshan's brows moved slightly. He smiled meaningfully, and suddenly lowered his head to kiss her. Why did you suddenly kiss me? Jinwan was afraid that the reason he did not sleep was because he wanted to continue squeezing her. She subconsciously wanted to jump out of his embrace. If they were to do it again today, she would definitely lose her life. Previously, she was already half dead. She felt that right now, her little life was in his hands. Mo Jingshan did not answer her earlier question. He only softly said, Previously, I said that the person I'm bringing you to meet will come over tomorrow. You don't have to wake up too early. If you want to go out, wait for the person to come before going out. After speaking, he finally let go of her and got up to take a shower. Jinwan laid on the bed and looked at the messages on her phone. When he came out, she was just about to bring her laptop to the study when the man, who came out of the bathroom, pulled her onto the bed. Chapter 141. Hurry and go to sleep. I'll go to the study. Jinwan reached out to retrieve the laptop that had fallen on the carpet by the bed. Mo Jingshan placed her on the bed and pressed his body against hers. He planted a kiss on her swollen lips that had been ravaged in the afternoon. Tired? He kissed her. Jinwan nodded seriously. She was really tired. She almost hugged his thigh and begged him to spare her life. This man's stamina was not something she could handle. He lowered his head and kissed her ear. Then, he lay down beside her and stretched out his long arms to hold her in his arms. His low and husky voice was accompanied by his warm breath in her ear. Sleep with me, Anne? Jinwan obediently put down the computer and did not insist on going to the study. She turned around and buried herself in his arms, holding him with both hands. She gently said in his arms, All right. The next day, when Jinwan woke up, it was already past 9 in the morning. After washing up, she changed her clothes and went downstairs. Seeing Auntie Chen busily serving breakfast to the dining table, she felt that she hadn't felt this warm and peaceful in a long time. After breakfast, Jinwan went straight to the studio. As soon as she stepped out of the villa, she looked up and was stunned to see a tall, thin, short-haired woman about 1.7 meters tall standing in the yew garden by her car. Jinwan subconsciously took a step back and turned to ask Auntie Chen, Who is this? Can any stranger enter the yew garden now? Auntie Chen walked out, took a look, and answered with a smile. Madam, Mr. Mo let her in. Mr. Mo said to let her follow you from now on. Ah, follow me? Jinwan paused for a moment before returning to herself. She turned to look at the tall, thin, short-haired young woman. Mrs. Mo, my name is Feng Ling. I've trained at the 11 Training Center in the United States for 8 years. From today onwards, I'll be your personal bodyguard. Seeing Jinwan's shocked and confused look, the man reached out to open the car door, motioned for Jinwan to get in, and gestured for her to get in. They seemed to be well trained. Jinwan secretly wondered, could it be that the person Mo Jingshan wanted her to meet was this person in front of her? A female bodyguard? Did Mo Jingshan really ask you to come? Jinwan asked. She had only seen male bodyguards. This was her first time seeing a female bodyguard. Feng Ling answered respectfully and seriously. Yes, Mrs. Mo Jinwan. Jinwon looked at her for a long time, but since she was sent by Mo Jingshan, she had no reason to be suspicious. She opened the door of the driver's side and was about to get in when Feng Ling suddenly said, "Mrs. Mo, you should sit here. I'll drive you." "Are you driving?" "Yes, when you go out in the future, whether you're driving or taking other cars, I have to be by your side. I'll also drive the car to ensure your safety." All right. This bodyguard was too serious and rigid. Jinwon guessed that she was completely obedient and did not make things difficult for her. She walked around the car and sat on the passenger seat where the door was already open. After getting on the car, she told him where she was going and then picked up her cell phone to call Mo Jingshan. When the call connected, Mo Jingshan directly pointed out the purpose of her call. "What is it? About the bodyguards?" "The person you said you wanted me to meet is the bodyguard you arranged for me? It's this, Feng Ling." Jinwon turned to look at Feng Ling, who was driving. The other party was completely unaffected by her call and continued to drive without a word. Nanheng is the direct superior of 11 training center in America. Feng Ling is the most skilled and has the highest level of training there. Initially, I planned to have Nanheng introduce you to her, Mo Jingshan calmly explained to her. Nanheng has an urgent matter to attend to in America this morning. He doesn't plan to waste any more time, so he sent Feng Ling to the U Garden to meet you. Jinwon did not have much of an impression of Nanheng, but she knew that the two closest brothers to Mo Jingshan were Qin Siding and Nanheng, who was once famous in Haicheng and later became famous in America. She was not very clear about this person's background. She only knew that he was close to Mo Jingshan and seemed to be in the arms business. He was the type who licked blood from the tip of a gun. "From today onwards, Feng Ling will be your personal bodyguard. Her skills are not bad, and she is quiet and reticent. She won't disturb you, and will only stay by your side when necessary. At other times, she won't make you feel uncomfortable." Jinwon made several sounds of assent and hung up the phone. She then turned to look at the responsible bodyguard. After thinking for a moment, she sent a message to Mo Jingshan. "You picked so many people, but in the end, you chose a female bodyguard for me. Her personality is so old-fashioned and serious. I don't even know how to talk to her." Mo Jingshan replied, "You want me to send a male bodyguard to chat with you?" Jinwon, I can consider this." Mo Jingshan, don't even think about it." Jinwon. After arriving at the Jinlin building where Emonwan's studio was located, Feng Ling parked the car and very consciously disappeared from her sight. As expected, she was well-trained. Jinwon entered the studio. Ever since the studio was invested by Mo Corporation, many things had to be put on the agenda. Jinwon did not forget that she was still carrying a debt of $200 million. Boss, Xiaoba had given Jinwon a call early in the morning. Seeing that Jinwon had arrived, she rushed over to hand the new financial report to her. Previously, Supervisor Su really did something to the report. "Yesterday, I went to the finance department to review it again and redid it based on the company's income and expenditure. It's exactly the same as your budget. There's no difference at all." Jinwon received it and glanced at it. She then raised her brows and glanced at Xiaoba. "You worked overtime in the studio yesterday and redid it yourself?" Xiaoba nodded. Her expression was somewhat bashful, yet wanting to be praised. Right now, many of the people left in the studio aren't very professional. Right now, the finance department is also like a pile of loose sand. I'm not sure if I can do it, so I gave it a try last night." She did not expect this adorable intern assistant to have such a meticulous and serious heart. Jinwon smiled. "Let's start recruiting in the next 2 days. Have the remaining people from the HR department come to my office later." "All right, boss." Xiaoba's face was filled with excitement as she turned to leave. Jinwon suddenly reached out to tug on her collar. "Why are you so excited?" Xiaoba turned back and pushed her glasses. She grinned and said, "Because our studio now has an investment of $200 million. All of the construction projects can continue as normal. Furthermore, we have such a huge backing like Mo Corporation. Just thinking about it makes me feel that we will rise to become the largest real estate company in Haicheng. At that time, I will be the most senior employee in the company. How can I not be excited? Jin Wan. Chapter 142. Jin Wan sat in her office, staring at the computer screen on her desk. The studio was still in the stage of preparation. From an outsider's perspective, there were only expenses and no income. No one knew what Jin Wan was planning. Some even thought that Mo Jingshan was so rich that he would casually throw her $200 million for her to squander. Even though Jin Wan had received such a large investment, her studio was still not viewed favorably by most people. The domestic real estate market continued to decline. Many companies were eager to sell the land they had previously obtained at high prices. Jin Wan now had sufficient funds on hand. Not only could the several projects under the studio's name continue to be carried out, but she had also expanded her target to several large cities and suburbs around High City. Every place that was valuable to her was marked with a red circle on the electronic map. Which cities would continue to expand in the future, which abandoned residential areas or barren lands that were currently not valued, were also marked with a blue circle. She was purchasing. From an outsider's perspective, she was purchasing crazily. They thought that she did not understand the market, and that she would definitely lose everything. All of a sudden, there was a knock on the office door. Xiaoba rushed in with an extremely anxious expression. Jin Wan only glanced at her before returning her gaze to the computer screen. She unhurriedly scanned through the map of High City and its surroundings, marking out the places that would definitely be included in the city's plans. Boss Wan, that CEO Jin's husband from last time, is here. Xiaoba had run in too much of a rush. She swallowed her saliva before rushing to say, and he brought a few people with him. It seems like he's here to settle scores with us. Jin Wan's hand paused on the mouse. She turned around. CEO Jin's husband? Settle what scores? Her words had just landed when the office door was heavily pushed open with a pung sound. Xiaoba jumped in fright. Jin Wan noticed the few people who had suddenly barged in. The ones walking in front were tall and strong. They appeared to be those unreasonable thugs and bodyguards who wielded machetes and went around demanding debts. With those people clearing the way, a man who was about 40 years old walked in. He was well dressed, but he didn't have a good expression on his face. Although he didn't look ferocious, he obviously didn't look like a god of plague that could be easily sent away. After the man entered, he looked around the office coldly and arrogantly, and finally fixed his eyes on Jin Wan behind the desk. Are you Miss Ji? Jin Wan sat behind the office desk. Her gaze was indifferent, and she was unhurried. I remember that the security guards of Jin Lin building are rather diligent. To be able to bring someone in like this, you're not simple. As if he didn't expect a young woman to have such a strong aura, the man coldly raised his eyebrows and smiled again. However, his smile made people feel a chill down their spines. I didn't expect Miss Ji to be so daring at such a young age. I've heard about Mo Corporation investing in you. I know that Miss Ji has a backer. But no matter how strong your backer is, you shouldn't meddle in other people's business. The man seemed to be smiling, but his tone was cold and unkind. Jin Wan's beautiful brows rose without a trace. I was wondering why you suddenly came here. So it's because your backyard is on fire, and you've been suppressing a stomach full of vexation. So you came here to vent it out? As she spoke, Jin Wan chuckled softly. CEO Jin came here to make a fuss a few days ago. The two of you are truly husband and wife. One brought a lawyer to terminate the contract, while the other brought thugs to block the door. Those who don't know would think that the two of you are opening some charaba. You're not even in charge of a proper investment company. The man coldly narrowed his eyes. You also know that I'm here to block the door? I don't wish for your studio to be smashed into smithereens just after it was built. I'll have to trouble Miss G to make a trip with me right now and explain the video you obtained to my wife. Jin Wan ignored him. She casually pulled up the information of this investment company on her computer. CEO Jin, who came to terminate the contract previously, was the person in charge of Tiansheng Investment Company's finance department. The person before her was the general manager of Tiansheng Investment Company. His surname was Xiao. And he was also the legal representative and founder of this company. Jinwon turned back to look at him. Her tone was gentle and calm. Mr. Xiao, I have no interest in your family matters. The private dealings between you and the previous finance department manager of our studio have nothing to do with me. Supervisor Su committed the crime of embezzlement, which was why I handed her over to the police. I personally handed over all the crimes she committed at work to the police. I don't care if you're here today, because CEO Jean found out about your shady dealings and started a fight with you. Or if you're here to seek justice for Supervisor Su. None of this should be blamed on our studio. I'm the person in charge here. It's my right to hand over employees who have committed crimes to the police. You're a successful man nearing his 40s. You have a family and a child. Do you need me to teach you such simple logic that even a primary school student would understand? CEO Zhao's expression was extremely displeased. You're a little girl who hasn't even grown up yet. Are you trying to lecture me? Of course not. I'm not the type of person who would waste my breath on unrelated people. Jinwon coldly curved her lips. To me, it's only Supervisor Su who committed a crime. As for the shady dealings between you and her, since I can find out about it, the police can easily follow the clues and find out as well. Since this matter has passed through the police's hands, it's not strange for your wife to find out about it. So, what's the point of you coming here to act tough? It's not like I allowed you to stay in such an unsafe little hotel. It's not like I was the one who installed illegal cameras. You can't control your lower body. And now you're taking your anger out on us? Ji Bian's face seemed to carry a smile, but his eyes were filled with mockery. Don't King talk nonsense with me here. If I were to get a divorce because of this, the company's shares will change. I'll lose at least several 100 million yuan. How can it be resolved with just a few words from you? Just because you have a backer, you dare to be so arrogant. I think you little girl are asking for a lesson. CEO Zhao's expression suddenly turned cold as he gave the thugs a look. The thugs abruptly kicked over the coffee table and spare chairs in the office. They moved forward to drag Jinwon out. Jinwon's brows furrowed. She did not expect these people to be so unreasonable as to act unreasonably in front of her. She stood up and was about to signal the frightened Xiaoba to hurry out and call the police. However, one of the thugs suddenly grabbed Xiaoba's collar and dragged her back. Ah! Xiaoba cried out softly. Jinwon's expression changed. She rushed out and was about to help Xiaoba up when the thug suddenly raised his hand to grab Jinwon's hair. Almost at the same time, there was another loud bang from the office door. A figure decisively rushed in. Jinwon had yet to react when Feng Ling, who had abruptly entered, pulled her behind her. Chapter 143. Feng Ling stepped on one of the men's crotch and stomped down harshly. The cries on the ground intensified, causing the office glass to tremble. Jinwon wanted to hold Feng Ling back, but was unable to. The short-haired woman's movements were unbelievably nimble. In an instant, CEO Xiao, who was standing by the side in shock, was kicked in the face. He fell to the ground pathetically, and half his face turned green. There were two more thugs behind them. Seeing this, they immediately rushed over while cursing. Jinwon's fingers gripped Feng Ling's clothes tightly, worried that someone would die. This time, she truly understood how powerful Mo Jingxian was. Right now, she was worried that CEO Zhao's thugs would not be able to leave this place alive. Jinwon resisted the urge to clap and cheer. Her studio had just started. If a murder case were to occur just like that, it would be a huge taboo in doing business. One of the thugs angrily reached over to grab Jinwon's hair and drag her out. The moment his hand approached Jinwon, Feng Ling raised her leg and kicked him. It was as though no matter who the other party was, as long as they dared to touch Jinwon, she would not be polite. Feng Ling directly injured the two men's legs. She could vaguely hear the sound of their kneecaps breaking. Jinwon's back trembled. She then saw that the two men's manhood was about to be destroyed under Feng Ling's feet. Wait! Don't kick them! Jinwon rushed to grab Feng Ling's arm. There's a police station near this building. Call the police to come and take them away. There will be people who will teach them a lesson. This country isn't like your overseas training base. Don't kill them. Feng Ling's movements finally paused. Her expression was cold and vicious as she glanced at the trash rolling on the ground. She originally thought that since Jin Wan was in the studio and there were security guards in this building, she would be fine as long as she did not go out. She took some time to buy a bottle of water. However, the moment she returned, she heard screams and the sound of things being kicked over. She rushed in to see that Jin Wan was almost injured by those people. Feng Ling did not speak. She moved her foot away from the man's manhood and retreated behind Jin Wan, maintaining a distance that would not hinder her, but ensure her safety. Jin Wan helped Xiaoba up. "Are you all right?" Xiaoba shook her head, looked nervously at the person behind Jin Wan, and whispered, "Boss, she's amazing." Jin Wan smiled. Previously, she had doubted how capable this female bodyguard was. As it turned out, his suspicions were unnecessary. He really shouldn't have. Since she was someone Mo Jingshan had specially selected to be by her side, how could she not be powerful? The police arrived very quickly. When they took the thugs away, President Xiao was also dragged up in a sorry state. Jin Wan specially asked the police officer in charge of the previous incident. She confirmed that the video of CEO Xiao and supervisor Su having an affair outside had been discovered by them after their investigation, and that it was not someone from her studio who had nosily handed over the video on her computer. Only then did she feel reassured. As long as these things really had nothing to do with the people in her studio, she was too lazy to ask again. When President Xiao was brought away, he heard Jin Wan's conversation with the police officer. He was slightly vexed, and his expression was difficult to calm down. It was clear that he had already been disturbed at home. A man who originally had good looks and a good family background was beaten black and blue by a female bodyguard in the blink of an eye. Right now he could not even raise his head. He could only glare at Jin Wan with indignation. In the end, in the next moment, he was held down by the police and brought away. In the evening, Jin Wan went to the construction site under the studio's name and returned after an hour. In the car, Jin Wan sat in the back row, supporting her head with one hand as she read the documents in her other hand. When she heard her phone ring, she picked it up and listened to the report from the HR department. Right now, she had a good understanding of many industries and market trends in the country. She could also guarantee that in the future, the studio would be able to expand. In time, it would definitely become the largest real estate group in the country. However, making money from doing business and managing a business were two different things. Right now, because the studio had received far more investment than expected, the amount of land and real estate she had to purchase would also increase. The studio needed to expand, and the HR department, finance department, and other departments had countless things for her to worry about every day. Jin Wan vainly hoped that in this life, she could stand at the peak of both love and career. However, although she had previously studied in America and had a good degree, she did not have a major in business management or business operation. Even if her brain and foresight were sufficient, she was still somewhat lacking in management. She had only just started, and she was already in a terrible mess. These 2 days, Xia Tian had sent her a message saying that she would come to her studio to help after being discharged from the hospital. However, this was still not enough. Jin Wan supported her head with her hand and placed her phone aside. She turned to look at the darkening sky outside the car window. At night in the U Garden, with Auntie Chen's dinner, Jin Wan most likely would not have the opportunity to see Mo Jingshan personally cook for a while. On the dining table, Mo Jingshan's chopsticks had just reached over, and Jin Wan's chopsticks accidentally bumped into it. He glanced at her and used his chopsticks to pick up another dish. Jin Wan's chopsticks followed. Like this, the chopsticks fight for a long time before Mo Jingshan finally put down his chopsticks. His deep, dark eyes stared unblinkingly at Jin Wan, and there seemed to be a faint smile hidden in his eyes. The man's hand was casually placed on the table, and his posture was leisurely. It was a stark contrast to Jin Wan, who seemed to have something on her mind. Something on your mind? His slender fingers picked up the dishes in front of him, placing them in front of Jin Wan in case she could not reach them. Jin Wan finally returned to herself. She raised her head to meet his interested gaze, and when she lowered her head, she saw that almost all of her favorite dishes had been placed in front of her. She directly put down her chopsticks, saying, "Recently, I plan to buy some books on business management and self-study at home. Do you have any good books to recommend?" Mo Jingshan picked up the glass on the table, lowering his head to slowly drink a mouthful of water. Even though he was drinking ordinary water, he still had the elegance and composure of a high-end red wine. Following which, the man unhurriedly said, "It's just an investment of 200 million yuan, and it's already giving you so much pressure? You still want to buy books to self-study business management?" Why did it feel like he was mocking her? Jinwan picked up her chopsticks again, picking up a mouthful of vegetables and placing it in her mouth to chew. She unhappily said, "Why do I feel like the great CEO Mo is looking down on me? Only you can turn 50 million yuan into 3 billion yuan in 3 years. Can't I be better than you?" Chapter 144. Jinwan pursed her lips. "No, I'm only suitable to be your wife. It's fine to be kissed, hugged, and raised up by you. If you were to be my tutor, I'm sure you'd scold me until I develop a fragile heart." The smile on Mo Jingshan's handsome face deepened. He reached out to ladle a bowl of soup for Jinwan. "How could I possibly scold you?" That's right, he wouldn't scold her. Wasn't using his actions to make her cry from night to day a more brutal punishment? "Eat first. Don't sit there in a daze," Mo Jingshan reminded. Jinwan picked up the bowl and began eating. She quickly and decisively finished her meal, before running upstairs into Mo Jingshan's study to look for books. In the end, after searching for a long time, she could not find the books she wanted to read. Instead, they were mostly famous business cases and books in various languages. The rest were mostly files from the company temporarily placed at home. Unable to find them, Jinwan gave up on his study. She turned around to leave when she saw the man standing by the study door. The light in the study was not particularly bright. Mixed with the moonlight shining in from the window, it made him appear like a cool breeze and a bright moon. However, he appeared slightly mysterious. "What are you looking for?" He entered and reached out to hold Jinwan's back, pulling her in front of him. His fingers gently caressed her hair and slender back. His warm breath landed on Jinwan's cheek, warm and ambiguous. Jinwan thought in her heart, as expected, she couldn't let Mo Jingshan be her tutor. Otherwise, whenever she looked for him to study, he would flirtatiously throw her onto the bed for a while. It would really affect the progress of her studies. "I thought there would be books on business management in your study. In the end, there isn't a single one. I don't read those things. Of course, there aren't any." Thus, some geniuses were born with it. Managing such a large company, and still managing it in an orderly manner. When Mo Jingshan took over America's Shine Group in the future, he would most likely be just as skilled or even more skilled. Mo Jingshan's cell phone rang. Jinwan did not delay him from picking it up. She turned back to his study and brought out a classic English book with business cases to read. When he returned from the call, the man carried her, who was reading on the bed, onto his lap. Jinwan shifted her gaze away from the book and raised her eyes. "Why are you looking at me? I don't understand the books in other languages in your study. I can only read this book in English." Mo Jingshan glanced at her again and took the book from her hands. He flipped through several pages and stopped halfway through, returning the book to her. "There are a few foreign real estate marketing cases at the back of this page," he said lightly. Jinwan took a few more serious glances and raised her head to look at his handsome and perfect side profile. She asked in surprise, "The books on the bookshelves are written in at least 7 or 8 languages from different countries. Don't tell me you've read all of them? And you remember the contents of every single book?" He chuckled and calmly hugged her. Having a photographic memory is also an essential instinct for a business manager. No matter when or where, you must have an impression of every detail that concerns the company, big or small, so that you can better judge the situation and make the most perfect analysis and decision. Jinwan raised the book. "You're going to teach me now? If you can maintain your gentlemanly attitude, I can consider letting you be my tutor." Mo Jingshan held back his laughter, caressing her face. "I've slept with you countless times inside and out. Now you want me to be a gentleman? Lying to myself is not the attitude a business manager should have. She could not win against him. Jinwon lowered her head to continue reading. Even when night fell, she was still staring at the book on the bed. Emo Jingshan pulled her under the blankets and lightly said, "Grandfather just called. He asked us to return to the Emo family home for a night the day after tomorrow. Why are you suddenly going back? Is there something?" Emo Jingshan brought Jinwon into his embrace. And Shuyan and her father will be staying at the Emo family home as guests for the next few days. Their flight back to America has already been booked. Although grandfather does not plan on having too much of a relationship with the Yin family, as the head of the Emo family, he still has to be polite. He asked us to go back for a meal as a farewell. Why do I feel that this isn't a request grandfather would make? Jinwon raised her head to look at Emo Jingshan's expression. Emo Jingshan rubbed her head. You saw through it, but didn't say it out loud. You're smart. With me around, no matter if it's the Emo family or the Ji family, no one will dare to eat you. Jinwon bit down on his chin. It's already good enough that I didn't eat in Shuyan. Who can eat me? Ah. Emo Jingshan bit back on her lips. I can eat. Jinwon raised her head to continue biting him. The two of them bit for a long time. Jinwon's breathing became more hurried. In the end, she hurriedly called for a stop, and did not move around under him. Emo Jingshan's hand held her slightly cold feet under the blankets. His brows furrowed slightly. Your feet are so cold. It's almost mid-autumn. The weather outside is only a few degrees above zero. Every year, my hands and feet are always cold at this time. Jinwon allowed her feet to remain in his palms, and did not pull them out. I heard from the elderly that when your hands and feet are cold, it means that no one is hurting you. Emo Jingshan kissed the corner of her lips. Haven't I doted on you enough? Jinwon had only said it casually, but in the blink of an eye, she was instantly killed by his words. She could not retort back, and simply moved her feet in his palms. In an instant they were held by him again. I won't torment you anymore. Rest early. When you return to the Emo family, go to the back mountain to soak in a hot spring. It'll help with your cold body. His tone was light. Jinwon's eyes immediately brightened. The Emo family's back mountain's hot spring? Isn't that a place that doesn't allow outsiders to enter easily? You're Mrs. Emo, not an outsider. Emo Jingshan's words landed, using his gaze to warn her to quickly place the book in her hands aside. He softly said, sleep. Perhaps because she was used to being dominated by him in bed. Jinwon immediately obediently placed the book on the bedside table. The next day, Fengling drove. Jinwon sat in the car, and browsed through the news on her phone. She suddenly saw the news of Hai Qingtian, Sheng Investment Company being taken down. Even if the police were to interfere, their actions would not have been so fast. Furthermore, with money, even the devil would turn millstones. If CEO Xiao and CEO Jin both wanted to protect the company, they could bear with each other, and turn the big problem into a small one. The police would not be able to continue interfering. Now that this company had suddenly been taken down, it was equivalent to closing down overnight. Jinwon's fingers paused on the screen. She turned to look at Fengling, who was driving. Yesterday's matter, did you tell Emo Jingshan? Fengling focused on driving while replying, yes. No wonder. Emo Jingshan was really too black-bellied. Last night he did not make a move. In the end, this company actually quietly died in his hands. Chapter 145. The next evening, Jinwon and Emo Jingshan returned to the Emo home together, and saw several cars parked in the front yard. Director Emo had only returned to the country once, but there were already so many cars following him. As the owner of Shine Group, he was indeed extraordinary. Returning to the country, there were countless bodyguards by his side. Even the bodyguards' cars were all luxury cars worth at least 1,000,000 yuan. It was truly an extraordinary extravagance. By the time the two entered the Emo home, because it was approaching mid-autumn, there was already a festive atmosphere in the house. The moment they entered the front hall, they saw Elder Emo and Emo Xiaozi drinking tea and chatting with Father An. It was as though they were discussing something worth being happy about, and their faces were all filled with smiles. And Shuyan sat by Father An's side. She raised her eyes to see Jinwan and Mo Jingshan walking in with their fingers intertwined. Seeing this scene, Mo Xiao's originally smiling face instantly darkened. He glanced at Father An, and when Father An saw Jinwan, his gaze became more distant and cold. He looked at Jinwan with a judgmental gaze. Grandfather. Jinwan greeted Elder Mo as though there was no one around. Her expression was natural, and she was not swayed by those people's gazes. She then calmly looked at Mo Xiaoza, whose expression was not very good. Dad. Mo Xiaoza coldly retracted his gaze, and did not even make a sound in response. Jinwan did not feel awkward. She smiled at Father and Mr. and hello. I'm Jingshan's wife. My name is Jinwan. After all, Jinwan's attitude was neither servile nor overbearing. No matter how unhappy Father An was, he could not show it as obviously as Mo Xiaoza. Furthermore, Elder Mo was sitting by the side with a smile. No need to be polite. Miss Ji, please sit, Father An replied. And Shuyan also revealed a polite and mild smile. She looked at Jinwan and then at Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan handed the gift box that Jinwan had bought on the way to the housekeeper, Uncle O, saying, Jinwan heard that Dad and Uncle An are going back to the United States. She knows that it's hard to drink authentic domestic tea abroad, and she knows that Dad and Uncle An have a hobby of tasting tea for many years. So she specially bought a few boxes of Bai Luo Chun before coming here. There was obvious dissatisfaction on Mo Xiao's face, but after all, now was not the time to instigate Jinwan in private. Seeing that Jinwan had been so natural and polite since she entered the door, he could not find any fault with her. He frowned slightly and coldly answered, and leave it. Just as Uncle O was about to take the boxes of tea they brought to the back, Elder Mo suddenly looked back and raised his eyebrows. Is it Dongting Bilyuakun? This is indeed an authentic good tea that is hard to buy overseas. I haven't drunk Bai Luo Chun in a long time. Quick, brew the tea that Ji last brought. I want to taste it first. Okay, Grandpa. Uncle O answered and left. Ji lass, don't just stand there. Why are you still standing in front of your own house? Come and sit with Grandpa. Elder Mo waved to Jinwan again. Jinwan walked over with a smile, exchanged a look with Mo Jingshan, and sat down next to Elder Mo. Speaking of which, this is the second time I've seen Miss Ji. At this time, Father An suddenly spoke, looking at Jinwan inquiringly. That day at the dinner party of Shine, I didn't have a chance to talk to Miss Ji. I only remember that Jingshan took you upstairs. Was Miss Ji not feeling well at that time? Almost everyone present knew what had happened to Jinwan that day. Mo Xiaoza, the initiator of the incident, was sitting next to him, but Father An asked this question. He was clearly deliberately making things difficult for Jinwan. Jinwan smiled frankly. That day, I accidentally drank too much and fell asleep in the bathroom. If Jingshan hadn't found me, I would have slept in there all night. I was so shameful that day. Mr. An, please don't make fun of me. Elder Mo, on the other hand, laughed by the side. The others naturally could not laugh. Her reply was too magnanimous. It was like a child who had accidentally drunk too much and was sticking out her tongue to beg for forgiveness in front of her elders. However, she avoided being instigated. This caused Father An to involuntarily narrow his eyes. Mo Jingshan's gaze carried a smile, and his tone was calm as he spoke. The small matters between husband and wife really shouldn't be brought up to the table. She usually doesn't have many opportunities to drink, and her alcohol tolerance is indeed poor. That night, she only drank a few glasses of champagne before finding a place to sleep. It took me a long time to find her. A few glasses of champagne, and you're already drunk. Miss G's alcohol tolerance is indeed not good. Father An also smiled, but his smile did not reach his eyes. Mr. An, you really are making fun of me. When I was young, I often took medicine. During those years, I was allergic to alcohol. After I grew up, I was no longer allergic, but my father never allowed me to drink. My temper is a little stubborn. I feel that if others can drink, I can also drink. Thus, I often find opportunities to secretly drink a few glasses, but every time, I'm a complete drunk. She smiled as she spoke. Jingshan is also always controlling me. That night, I secretly hid by the side and drank a few glasses. In the end, I almost made a fool of myself. Jinwan lowered her brows as though she was very embarrassed. These few days, Jingshan has been nagging me quite a bit. In the future, he most likely won't allow me to touch a single drop of alcohol. He's even stricter than my father. Father An's smile faded slightly. His eyes coldly stared at Jinwan, who had been smiling the entire time. He was already somewhat unhappy, but he did not say it out loud. For a man to control his wife like this, to the point that he would constantly watch over such a small matter like drinking, the underlying meaning was that Mo Jingshan really cared about Jinwan. Mo Xiaozi could hear that Jinwan, this clear-headed little lass, was purposely putting Father An in a bad spot. His cold voice abruptly rang out. If your alcohol tolerance isn't good, then don't come out and walk around. After all, you still have the title of Mrs. Mo on your head. If there's a day when you drink a few drops of alcohol in public, you won't only be throwing away your own face. The moment Mo Xiaozi's words came out, before anyone else could speak, Elder Mo immediately glared at him. What are you talking about? That G-brat. No matter if she's at home or outside, no one can find any fault with her actions. Mo Xiaozi's sharp gaze turned cold. In front of everyone, being carried back to the room by Jingshan in front of everyone. Isn't that embarrassing enough? In front of so many people, just whose actions are the most unpresentable. Mo Jingshan calmly spoke. His voice was cold. Do you really want to say it out loud here? Although Mo Jingshan's voice was clearly no different from his usual tone, everyone present could acutely sense the hidden undercurrent within. They only needed to be distracted for a moment, and it was as though they would be frozen into ice by his silent, biting coldness. Chapter 146. Mo Jingshan's eyes were dark. His thin lips curved up, but his smile was cold. It's exactly what the words mean. After exposing everything under the thin paper in front of everyone, Mo Xiaozi's expression could no longer maintain his composure. His expression was enraged. The father and son exchanged glances. In an instant, the hall became as cold as an icehouse. And Shuyan, who sat by Father An's side, did not speak. She raised her eyes to see Mo Jingshan sitting there. Although his expression was cold, he still maintained the position of holding Jinwan's 10 fingers. His 2 long legs wrapped in his suit pants were lazily crossed. His entire person appeared calm and casual, but his brows carried a viciousness that surpassed this hypocritical calmness. The matter of Jinwan being locked in the restroom that day, he did not plan on letting it go so peacefully. This topic should not have been brought up in the first place. If they really brought it up, the one who would suffer in the end would not be Jinwan, who had been pressured by them. Just as Mo Xiaozi was about to open his mouth in anger, and Shuyan warmly suggested, Grandfather Mo, I heard that the back mountain of the Mo family has a spring that was dug out 100 years ago. It's connected to Haicheng's dragon vein, and is a natural 4-colored hot spring that is rarely seen in the country. Before returning to America, would Xu Yan have the luck to soak in this legendary Mo family hot spring? It was clear that Xu Yan was trying to change the topic and pause this scene of colliding icebergs. Mo Xiaozi unhappily glanced at Jinwan. However, Jinwan only smiled at him. Unlike the sharp words she used in front of the hotel that day, in front of outsiders, she still had her own sense of propriety. Although this young girl appeared to be relying on Mo Jingshan's presence to protect her, her mind was clear, and she knew how to cooperate with Mo Jingshan. Every word, action, and action was perfectly coordinated. At this moment, Elder Mo was already smiling at Xu Yan. It's just a private hot spring at home. It's not as amazing as you say. Grandfather Mo, you're too humble. The Mo family's hot spring has always been famous in the country. And Xu Yan followed the elder's good mood and continued. I heard that frequently soaking in the Mo family's 4-colored hot spring can cure 100 illnesses. It's all because it's been exaggerated by outsiders. The so-called 4 colors hot spring is actually the result of the Chinese medicine developed by the Mo family over the last few decades. As Elder Mo spoke, he stood up. It just so happens that there are quite a few small hot springs on the other side of the hot spring. It's more suitable for you ladies to go together. Since Xu Yan wants to go take a look, then let's all go soak in it today. As he spoke, Elder Mo continued, Jing Shana, bring the Ji brat along. It's good for the body to soak in the hot spring often. Right now, the Ji brat is burdened with the mission of letting me carry my great-grandson as soon as possible. We can't miss out on something like this. Old Master Sheng's words were really well thought out, completely cutting off Shuyan's last chance to perform. He was truly protecting Jinwan, father, and did not know how to express his thoughts. And Shuyan continued to smile gracefully, but her gaze occasionally shifted toward Mo Jingshan's position. The Mo family's hot spring was indeed different from the various high-grade and low-grade hot springs outside. It was located in the back mountain of the Mo family's home, and was meticulously built in an antique-style cave. Although under Elder Mo's warm invitation, there were many people who came to soak in the hot spring together. Thankfully, the Four Colors hot spring was located in the center, and there were several small springs and hot springs that were blocked off. It was convenient for Shuyan and Jinwan. After all, the elder and the others were men. It was not a big deal for them to chat and soak in the Four Colors hot spring. However, Shuyan and Jinwan were women. Even if they were both wearing clothes, it was still not very appropriate. Jinwan was arranged to stay in the innermost medicinal spring. When she passed by the rose spring behind a stone door, she saw that Shuyan had already been brought in by the Mo family's helper. The medicinal spring was located in the innermost part of the hot spring cave. It was very secluded. When Jinwan sat in the hot spring, she felt slightly hot. After slowly adjusting to the temperature, her face began to sweat. She felt very comfortable and slowly stretched her body to lean against the spring. Her hair was tied up high, and her exposed neck and face were gradually covered in sweat due to the temperature of the water. After soaking like this for about 20 minutes, Jinwan was so comfortable that she almost fell asleep. All of a sudden, there seemed to be someone approaching from behind, but there was no particularly big movement. She abruptly returned to her senses and turned back to see Mo Jingshan walking in with the medicinal fragrance of the Four Colors hot spring. Jinwan was startled. Why aren't you continuing to stay with grandfather and the others? I can't possibly leave you here alone. It's easy to fall asleep after soaking in the hot spring for too long. I'm here to take a look. Mo Jingshan said he was only here to take a look, but he had already unhurriedly walked in. As he entered the pool of hot spring in front of her, the water surface rippled slightly. Jinwan originally sat in the hot spring without moving. The man's arm reached out from the water and directly pulled her over, asking, How do you feel? It's all right. It's just a little hot. Mo Jingshan smiled, holding her and sitting with her for a while. He lowered his eyes to see that her little face was slightly red from the heat of the water, and was about to kiss her on the cheek. All of a sudden, there seemed to be someone approaching from outside. Jinwan heard the sound. Afraid that someone would see her, she rushed to push him away. However, the man tightened his grip around her waist. At the same time, he turned back, calmly watching Shuyan, who had suddenly walked in. Shuyan clearly did not expect to see Mo Jingshan here. Nor did she expect to see the two of them in the hot spring, hugging each other. The moment she walked in and saw such a scene, her first reaction was not to leave immediately. Instead, she stood there, as though she had not returned to her senses for a while. Sorry. 10 seconds later, she forced herself to return to her senses. She looked at them. COMO, earlier on, I was a little bored at the Rose Spring and wanted to come over to chat with Mrs. Mo. I didn't expect. Mo Jingshan's tone was mild. There's nothing to apologize for. But if you and Jinwan are in the same hot spring, it will only be more boring. Shuyan's expression faltered. Jinwan also subtly glanced at Shuyan. The meaning behind Mo Jingshan's words was to mock Shuyan for running over to chat with Jinwan. In the end, it would only result in the two women sitting together awkwardly finding topics to talk about. Thus, it was true that there was no need for her to come and chat with Jinwan. Even if they did chat, there would not be any good things to talk about. This man had a poisonous tongue behind his composure. He was truly magnanimous and heartless. From start to finish, Mo Jingshan did not seem to have crossed the line with Shuyan in any way that he should not have. Even at the Shine Group's banquet, he was still cold and warm, maintaining a seal of alienation and indifference. Chapter 147. My apologies for disturbing you. Although Shuyan had suffered a blow, she maintained a polite smile on her face. She took one last deep look at the man in the same hot spring as Jin Wan before abruptly turning to leave. Only when Shuyan's footsteps were far away did Jin Wan place her chin on Imo Jingshan's shoulder. Secretarian is actually quite good at enduring. Based on her IQ and EQ, she may be able to endure failure and grievances. However, it's clear that you've hurt her pride. For a proud woman, pride is her true bottom line. Because at that moment, Jin Wan saw an unbearable suppression appear in Shuyan's eyes. Perhaps no matter how much she heard about Jin Wan and Imo Jingshan's love, it was not as much of a blow as seeing the two of them being so intimate in the hot spring. Imo Jingshan pushed aside her wet hair that was stuck to his neck. The warm water fell from his palm onto her collarbone. Jin Wan turned to look at the man's face that was inches from hers. Imo Jingshan's tone was calm. Do you wish for me to care more about her pride or your feelings? Jin Wan raised her brows, biting down on his shoulder. Why did you throw this suicidal question back at me? One is a woman who has nothing to do with me, and that little bit of pride that has nothing to do with me. The other is the wife I've set my heart on. The woman who will accompany me for the rest of my life. This is a very clear line between heaven and earth. She's the one who can't see it clearly. Imo Jingshan rubbed her ears, his voice low and gentle. You also know that this is a suicidal question. The correct answer is right there. Yet you insist on me giving you a reason to satisfy your curiosity. Jin Wan raised her lips, no longer biting him. Instead, she planted a kiss on his chin. It seems like I should stamp the #1 husband in history. Stamping is fine, but kissing is too simple. It's ineffective. The man held her waist under the water, planting a kiss on her lips. When we return to the room, stamp it properly. You can stamp it however you want. Don't mess around, This is the Imo family. It's more important to spend time with grandfather tonight. Jin Wan was serious. Imo Jingshan's tone was also very serious. It's also important to accompany your husband to sleep. After soaking for too long, he planned to leave the hot spring pool and return to his room to rest. Jin Wan stayed inside to change her clothes. When Imo Jingshan stepped out of the small hot spring, Shuyan was still wearing the hot spring outfit. Her long hair fell behind her. Hearing the movement, she turned back to look at Imo Jingshan. President Imo. Shuyan stared at his handsome face. Even though he had just come out from the hot spring, it was still elegant and warm. This is the Imo family after all. We are guests here. Thankfully, the person who entered earlier was me. If it was Uncle Imo or my father who saw this, who knows what they would think of Jin Wan. Shuyan's meaning was clear. She was hinting that Jin Wan was here seducing Imo Jingshan. If the two of them were to be intimate here, it was equivalent to not placing father and father Imo in their eyes. She almost blurted out the words immoral. Normally, a husband and wife would occasionally be intimate. I didn't expect it to be an eyesore to miss, and Jin Wan had already changed her clothes and walked out. Without waiting for the cold and indifferent Imo Jingshan to speak, she walked over with a light smile. Missin has a family background that causes others to shrink back, as well as an astute and intelligent upbringing. You must have your eyes on the top of your head. However, this sort of sanctimonious judgment shouldn't be placed on us. Jin Wan approached Imo Jingshan's side and glanced at Shuyan. We're legally married. Don't mention that we only kissed and hugged earlier. Even if we really did something uncontrollable, I'm afraid it wouldn't have anything to do with offending public morals. Shuyan originally wanted to use this opportunity to speak to Imo Jingshan alone. However, she did not expect Jin Wan to walk out so quickly, and in such a timely manner. This extremely taboo phrase of uncontrollable was, of course, something that only Jin Wan and Imo Jingshan could do. Shuyan was silent for a moment before smiling slightly. I've interacted with Mrs. Imo several times, but I still don't know you very well. I'll be leaving tomorrow. Are you sure you want to leave such an impression on me, Mrs. Imo? Jin Wan really wanted to laugh. It seemed like this Shuyan was really poisoned by Imo Jingshan. What she could not obtain was always the best. Even if she returned to America, He would forever be the evergreen tree and white moonlight in her heart. She would not allow any other woman to taint him. "Missin, you should know what kind of person I am. From the first time you met me in the company, you've already thoroughly investigated my trump card. Furthermore, is the impression I leave on you that important?" Jinwon raised her brows and chuckled lightly. "Missin, it's fine to be conceited, but don't be too arrogant and think too highly of yourself." Mo Jingshan coldly spoke. To Jinwon, the Mo family is her own home. How she acts at home is her freedom. There's no need to hide it. And Shuyan looked at him and suddenly chuckled. "I thought your feelings for Jinwon were only due to the responsibility of marriage and a momentary passion. After all, for someone like you who is always calm and rational, when it comes to marriage and feelings, you will definitely consider the benefits of all aspects. I didn't expect you to be so serious about her." Mo Jingshan did not speak. His gaze remained indifferent, and Shuyan raised her head and looked at him. A person who stands too high is not suitable to give all of his feelings. "You're so rational, yet you're willing to live such a life?" Mo Jingshan did not plan to continue speaking with her. He held on to Jinwon's hand and walked out. And Shuyan abruptly asked just as he was about to brush past them. "Do you think that you'll be together with her for the rest of your life?" "I will." Mo Jingshan turned and looked at her seriously. His tone was calm and not abrupt, but it heavily struck Jinwon's heart. "Are you so sure that you won't divorce her?" "I'm sure." He did not have the slightest bit of hesitation. His tone was unreasonably calm, but it was as though he was speaking of something that could not be more natural. The embarrassment on Shuyan's face could no longer be concealed. When she looked at him, her gaze was very deep. In the end, she abruptly turned and quickly walked away from their eyes. Her footsteps were slightly panicked. It was as though the conversation earlier did not affect Mo Jingshan at all. After Shuyan walked far away, he held on to Jinwon's hand and took long strides walking out. They had not walked far when Jinwon's heart stirred. She did not even know what she was thinking. She suddenly used the strength of his hand to quickly approach him, hugging him from behind. Mo Jingshan paused. He turned back to hug her. "What's wrong?" Jinwon raised her head in his embrace. "We'll be together for the rest of our lives without divorcing, ah. Right now, I still have some looks to look at. When I'm old and withered, are you sure you won't be tired of me?" Mo Jingshan raised his brows. "When you're old and withered, I'll only be older than you." Chapter 148. "And, even if it's tofu, this flower of mine will only be planted on you." Seeing that Jinwon was choked to the point of glaring at him, Mo Jingshan suddenly flicked her head. "What are you thinking about? Don't be so dirty." He was clearly the dirtiest. "It's about time. It's too stuffy here. Let's go out first." Mo Jingshan turned around. At this moment, the sound of Mo Xiaozi and Elder Mo's conversation could be heard from afar, accompanied by the sound of footsteps approaching. "Where's Jingshan?" After chatting for a while at the four-colored hot spring, he suddenly disappeared. "He still hasn't returned." It was Mo Xiaozi's icy voice. Elder Mo calmly replied. "Jingshan never liked to soak in the hot spring when he was young. He probably already left." "Don't tell me he went in to look for Jinwon? The Yin family is still here, yet that Jinwon dares to bother Jingshan. Just how disrespectful is she?" Mo Xiaozi said as he walked over. His tone was clearly unhappy. When Jinwon heard this, she subconsciously pushed Mo Jingshan into a crack in the corner of the cave. The space here was very small, and could only fit two people. They had to stick close to each other to stand steadily. Her entire body leaned against him. When Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes to glance at her, she raised her hand to make a shu expression. Mo Jingshan did not plan to dodge at all. However, seeing this little woman's expression was too vivid, he allowed her to press him against the crack of the rock. He held her waist to prevent her waist from being hit by the edge of the rock. "Right now, we can't be sure if Jingshan has already left. Jinwon probably isn't inside. Why are you still walking in?" Elder Mo nagged as he walked. "Besides, the reason why the young couple likes to stick together is because their relationship is good. You can't shake their feelings, yet you insist on forcefully interfering." Just what part of Jinwan is it that you don't like? I've always found this granddaughter-in-law to be very pleasing to the eye. Emo Xiaoza harumphed. Just based on the fact that the Ji family behind her can't compare to the Yin family, she's not qualified. Based on what you're saying, doesn't Jing Shun need to marry a foreign princess to be qualified? Princess? Heh, even if you have status but no brains, you're still trash. Io, you've really deified Shuyan too much. From what I see, all young ladies who are caught up in the conflict of love are all the same. Not many of them are rational. I don't think she's as perfect as you say she is. The human heart is more or less still greedy. It's just that some people hide it too well. Elder Emo harumphed. The old man and Emo Xiaoza had already approached. Their words were right beside their ears, separated by a stone wall behind the crack. Just as Emo Xiaoza was about to walk past them, Jinwan instinctively shrank back, clearly squeezing Emo Jingshan. Emo Jingshan lowered his gaze to look at her vexed expression. Earlier, she had clearly wanted to hide, but now that she knew she couldn't, he smiled and glanced at her teasingly. The old man was walking in front. His eyes swept over the stone crevice. His gaze paused, and the walking stick in his hand suddenly fell to the ground, rolling 2 meters backward. Io, why did my hand suddenly slip? The old man spoke and turned around. I think Jing Shun and Jinwan have already left. Stop looking, let's hurry out. Chapter 149. Elder Mo, who had just received the walking stick, suddenly sat on the ground with a putong sound. The walking stick also rolled several meters back. He scolded with a resentful expression. Your old man is already so old. After soaking in the hot spring for so long, my feet are already numb. I don't have any strength in my hands. Why are you looking for trouble for no reason? The more we walk in, the more stuffy it gets. Hurry and help me out. Seeing that the elder had already fallen to the ground, his acting was really too serious. Emo Xiaoza's expression was ugly. Even though he knew what was going on, he couldn't go any further. With a dark face, he picked up his walking stick and helped the old man, who was purposely groaning in pain, out. Only after the two of them had walked far away did Jinwan finally relax and lean against Emo Jingshan. Emo Jingshan sighed with a smile. Why are you hiding? Do you think he won't know if you hide here? He definitely knows. It's so obvious. It would be strange if he doesn't know. But it's still better than being caught on the spot, isn't it? Isn't this the same as avoiding his supercilious glare? Jinwan carefully poked her head out. After confirming that they had really left, she sighed. I didn't expect grandfather to be so good at acting. I also didn't expect you to be so good at hiding. Hiding in a place like this. Emo Jingshan brought her out from the crack in the rock. His words were clearly mocking the fact that the crack in the rock could not hide them at all. Jinwan retorted. Isn't it exciting? The man's eyes were fixed on her as he smiled. All right, let's hurry out. Otherwise, if Director Mo comes back later, it would be a waste of grandfather's Oscar-winning acting skills. Jinwan spoke as she held his arm and walked out. At the entrance of the hot spring in the back mountain of the Mo family, Emo Xiaoheng supported Elder Mo out. Seeing Shuyan standing outside, he directly asked, Shuyan, how long have you been out? Have you seen Jingshan? Shuyan's gaze was unmoved. She only glanced mildly at the entrance of the hot spring. Her mouth said, I haven't seen him. Emo Xiaoza did not miss the glance she had cast earlier. His sharp brows furrowed. Due to the elder's incessant Io cries of pain, he could not go back to grab them. He could only support the elder and leave with a livid expression. Even when Emo Jingshan and Jinwan came out, Shuyan still stood in the same spot. Jinwan's gaze landed on Shuyan, and Shuyan only curved her lips indifferently at her, before turning to look at Emo Jingshan. Emo Jingshan calmly asked, What time is the flight tomorrow? Shuyan's expression was no longer as obvious as it had been in the cave. She replied, It's very early. I'll probably have to leave for the airport at dawn. Emo Jingshan nodded lightly. His hand was still around Jinwan's waist, and he took her away without saying anything more. Comma, was lit. Regardless of whether it was her past or past life, Jinwan had never walked on such a quiet path with Emo Jingshan. At this moment, the weariness and loneliness from her past life, as well as the pressure from Father Mo, seemed to have disappeared. The sound of the wind brushed past her ears. Jinwan suddenly held Emo Jingshan's hand tightly. The man sensed a slight change in her. His footsteps paused, lowering his eyes to glance at her. At the same time, Jinwan raised her eyes to smile at him. The little woman's smile curved her eyes. Emo Jingshan looked at her. "What's wrong?" Jinwan shook her head mysteriously. Women were often emotional creatures. No matter how many lives they had lived, they were no exception. She was only thinking about what he had said earlier. They would be together for the rest of their lives. There would be no divorce. Jinwan tightened her grip on his hand. It was late at night. After all, she had soaked in a hot spring with Chinese medicine. Although it was good for the body, it was normal to feel thirsty. Jinwan was still awake at 11 o'clock. Emo Jingshan was lying by her side, leaning against the headboard. He was reading an email on his phone. Jinwan did not disturb him. She lifted the blanket and got off the bed. She only said, "I'll get someone to boil some hot water for us to drink." She then put on a coat over her pajamas and left the room with light footsteps. She was not particularly familiar with the Mo family home. Originally, there should be a helper downstairs who would occasionally come by to see if they needed anything. However, when Jinwan went downstairs, the helper was not around. Jinwan walked out. From afar, she saw that the lights in the front hall were still on. She guessed that the helper would be there and walked over. However, when she entered the front hall, she did not see any helper. She only saw Emo Xiaozi sitting on the sofa with an unpleasant expression. His brows were slightly furrowed. "Dad." Jinwan saw that his complexion was very bad. It seemed like he was not feeling well. Although she did not want to receive his cold gaze, she still walked over. Emo Xiaozi heard Jinwan's voice and turned to look at her coldly. "Why are you here?" "I wanted to get a helper to boil some water, but I couldn't find anyone. I saw that the lights were on, so I came over." Jinwan approached. "Where are you feeling unwell?" Emo Xiaozi impatiently furrowed his brows and raised his hand to press his forehead. His tone was neither cold nor warm as he said, "I'm getting old and can't stand the hot environment. I soaked in the hot spring for too long and had a headache for the entire night." Jinwan turned back to look at the surroundings. She still did not see any helpers and asked, "Are you the only one here? Didn't you get someone to bring medicine over? Is the pain very serious? Do you need to see a doctor? It's an old problem." "There's no need to take medicine." Emo Xiaozi placed his hand down and glanced at her with an unkind expression. "You don't have to pretend with me. If you want to drink water, go find it somewhere else. Don't stand here and make people sick of you." If not for the fact that he was Emo Jingshan's father, with Jinwan's explosive temper, she would not have tolerated him like this. She would have long lashed out at him, "All right? If your headache is so bad that you can't sleep, why don't I try to help you massage it?" Jinwan's tone was unhurried. Her calmness carried some patience and politeness toward an elder. Emo Xiaozi's eyelids twitched, coldly snorting. "You know how to massage? I'll give it a try." Jinwan did not say more. She walked around the sofa and stood behind him. Without waiting for Emo Xiaozi to coldly reject her, her fingers had already gently pressed against his head. She found the acupuncture point on his head and slowly increased her strength. Emo Xiaozi was silent for a moment. He did not say more, nor did he ask her to scram. He only sat there coldly. A moment later, he narrowed his eyes and said, "You know how to do this? My dad often has headaches, so I've learned a little. It's just that I've never had the chance to help him." Chapter 150. Jinwan smiled faintly. "How can I stop what others say? I admit that my personality has been spoiled by my father, but that doesn't mean I don't have any redeeming qualities. You've always been at the top. You should understand that in the upper class circle, others only see the glory on your body. If they find any black marks, they will magnify them and spread them out. They can't wait to tear off your glory and step into the ground. Who would care about your true nature?" Emo Xiaozi closed his eyes and allowed Jinwan to continue massaging his head. He was silent for a while and did not speak. After massaging for more than 10 minutes, although Jinwan's hands were sore, she maintained her previous strength. Although she was not a professional, the acupuncture points on his head were easy to find. She pressed them all accurately. Earlier at the hot spring, you and Jing Shun were both inside, Mo Xiaozi suddenly said. His tone was cold and heavy. Jinwan did not stop massaging his head. She calmly replied, yes. Yusher answered quickly. Back then, weren't you still hiding? He coldly reprimanded. I knew you would find out. And I didn't mean to offend you. I just subconsciously didn't want to have any conflict with you. So I hid. Jinwan took the opportunity when his attitude was not so distant to say, you should be able to tell that my marriage with Jing Shun is very harmonious. Our relationship is also very good. Today at the hot spring in the back mountain, we were indeed together the entire time. But isn't this only natural? Who gave you the courage to say the words only natural to me? I didn't agree. What do you mean by only natural? Mo Xiaozi still did not lower his face, and his tone was not pleasant. I know you have your own views. And Shuyan and I are indeed not the same kind of people. She is used to her strict and planned life, while I am a very casual person. I do what I should do, and say what I should say. Although I live a simple life, it doesn't mean I am blind and stupid. Jinwan smiled and gradually put down her hand. She gently pressed one side and said, and Shuyan and I are not the same kind of people. It's useless no matter how you put it. Jingshan also has a strict and planned life. Since young, he has been the Mo family's most favored successor. Mo Xiaozi coldly snorted. Jinwan curved her lips. You've never truly compared me to An Shuyan. You only firmly believe that she and Jingshan belong to the same world. Isn't this something that everyone can see? In what way can you compare to Shuyan? Although his head was indeed much more relaxed after being pressed by her, Mo Xiaozi seemed to be at loggerheads with her. Using An Shuyan's merits to compare with the so-called Jinwan you heard from others. Is this fair? Jinwan's attitude was calm, and there was a smile in her eyes. Her tone remained indifferent and quiet. Indeed, it is very unfair. A clear voice came from the back door of the front hall. Jinwan looked back, and saw that Mo Jingshan had come out. She didn't know how long he had been standing there watching and listening. Hearing Mo Jingshan's movements, Mo Xiaozi abruptly turned around. Mo Jingshan was only wearing soft and comfortable home clothes. Although he did not look as strict and noble as he usually did, his casual appearance was closer to the so-called simplicity that Jinwan had mentioned. It was clear that he had discovered that Jinwan had not returned. He did not even put on a jacket, and directly went downstairs to look for Jinwan. At the end of the day, in the end, don't you still have to rely on Jingshan to support you? The moment Mo Xiaozi saw Mo Jingshan, it was as though his supreme authority had been thoroughly challenged. His expression turned cold once more. Mo Jingshan slowly walked in, speaking indifferently. From start to finish, I've always been the one to protect her. I'm unwilling to see her suffer too much. I'm her husband. Isn't it only right for me to support her? For this woman, I've asked you to return to America to take over Shine several times, but you never agreed. What future can you have if you stay in Haicheng and guard your own Mo corporation? The Mo family's foundation is all in Shine. Your future also belongs to Shine. Mo Xiaozi appeared to be angered by Mo Jingshan's indifferent attitude and angrily rebuked him. Mo Jingshan did not respond. His gaze was indifferent. What kind of attitude is this? Is this the attitude you should have toward a father? Even now, I still don't understand the reason why you suddenly left America. After returning to the country, you established your own business because of your own ability. If you have the ability, I won't say anything. But you suddenly married Jinwan. And you didn't even tell me. Do you even have any respect for your father? The moment Mo Xiaozi met Mo Jingshan's indifferent expression, he angrily scolded while picking up the teacup on the coffee table opposite the sofa. He abruptly smashed it heavily toward Mo Jingshan. Jinwan almost instinctively ran over and decisively moved forward to block Mo Jingshan. The swiftly flying teacup smashed harshly against her thigh. Mo Xiaozi had really thrown the teacup with all his strength. This time, the pain caused Jinwan's entire leg to go numb. To throw it so harshly, He really could be so ruthless toward his own son. Mo Jingshan originally did not dodge. Jin Wan's charge was too sudden, and the teacup was smashed over in the blink of an eye. He abruptly tugged Jin Wan aside, glancing at her with furrowed brows before looking at her leg. Jin Wan was only smashed once, and did not feel much. She endured the pain, and raised her head to look at him. She shook her head and softly said, "It's all right, it's all right. You sure have the courage to block." Mo Xiaozi narrowed his eyes and harumphed coldly. Mo Jingshan's ink-black eyes were like a boundless night that had been baptized by a tornado. He glanced at Mo Xiaozi, his handsome face clear and cold. He directly pulled Jin Wan behind him, his low and heavy voice mild and indifferent. "Don't you know why I left America?" Mo Xiaozi coldly met his gaze. It was clear that his anger was unquenchable, yet he was suppressing his temper. "Aside from in Shuyan, have you ever put in any less effort by my side? Back then, when I was recovering from my heavy injuries in Los Angeles, what did you do?" Mo Jingshan's tone was low and cold. Right now, his eyes were filled with a coldness that Jin Wan had never seen before. Mo Jingshan was in Los Angeles. Heavily injured? Los Angeles? She had been to this place before. When she was studying in America, the city she stayed the longest in was Los Angeles. A blurry memory seemed to flash past her mind, but she did not manage to grasp it. Mo Xiaozi's sudden angry words drew all of her attention away. "What does that matter have to do with you staying in High City?" Mo Xiaozi angrily asked. However, the moment he finished speaking, Mo Xiaozi's figure suddenly paused. His gaze abruptly shifted toward Jin Wan, who was shielded behind Mo Jingshan. He coldly stared at her for a long time, before suddenly narrowing his eyes, as though he had thought of something. He coldly asked, "It's her?" Jin Wan's eyelids instantly twitched. What was her? Chapter 151. Mo Jingshan's expression remained cold as he slowly spoke. "I don't need anyone to tell me what to do in my life, even if it's my biological father." "You." Mo Xiaozi glared at him, but his gaze shifted to Jin Wan, who he had been protecting behind him. He suddenly furrowed his brows, narrowed his eyes and coldly said, "You've hardened your heart to go against me." Mo Jingshan appeared as though he did not hear him. He turned back to look at Jin Wan, gently caressing her leg. "Does it still hurt?" Of course it hurt. Right now, it was most likely bruised. But with her pajamas covering it, no one could see it. Jin Wan's expression did not change. "It's all right. It's already been so long. It doesn't hurt anymore. It's just a blow to my leg. Don't worry. It's my negligence." Mo Jingshan held her hand, gently caressing her fingers. This kind of thing will never happen again. What Jin Wan cared about was not whether her leg hurt or not, but that she could sense the hostility between the father and son. This man, Mo Jingshan, was really too good at hiding his emotions. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or angry. She actually only realized the huge problem between them now. "Dad." Jin Wan abruptly raised her head to say, "The Ji family's foundation is indeed not as solid as Miss N's family, but it's still a reputable figure in Haicheng. If it's just because of the difference in status, I can work hard to make up for it. The Mo family doesn't lack things like money and power. Isn't it my ability that you want to see?" Mo Xiaozi glanced at her coldly saying, "At least you have some self-awareness. I know you bought 2 companies from someone else, and even merged them into some studio. Let's not talk about whether Jingshan has invested in your studio. Let's talk about yourself. Even with such good resources, I don't see you earning a single cent. What right do you have to stand here and talk to me?" Hearing these words, Jin Wan smiled. The property industry had already stagnated this year. There was still a period of time to observe the market. She chose to wait and accumulate. If she did not hold it in now, how could she possibly double her capital in the future? But hearing Mo Xiaozi's words, it could be said that he had pointed out a bright path for her. She didn't know if it was because her attitude just now was commendable, that Mo Xiaozi's attitude was no longer as stubborn as before. "It sounds like you've already made plans. It's also a rare honor for me to grow step by step under the witness of the chairman of Shine Group," Jin Wan said. Mo Xiaozi narrowed his eyes and glanced at her fearless gaze. Do you know how much liquidity Shine Corporation has every minute? It's $10 million. Mo Xiaozi said coldly. It's almost equivalent to 70 million renminbi. I'll give you a week, can you earn it? Jin Wan pressed Mo Jingshan's raised hand hard and replied generously. All right. If I can't make it in a week, don't kick me out. I'll sign the divorce agreement and send it to you in America. Jin Wan. Mo Jingshan abruptly spoke up coldly. Jin Wan turned to look at him, smiling at him. I can. Trust me. Mo Jingshan stared at her, his gaze quiet and heavy. Without a word, he brought her out of the living room. Mo Xiaozi stood in the living room, coldly narrowing his eyes. 70 million in a week. This sort of condition was too simple. He had only said a few words of mockery, but Jin Wan had strangely tied a dead knot on this 70 million. Realizing that for a moment earlier, Jin Wan had purposely led him into a trap, Mo Xiaozi's originally ugly expression became even worse. Jin Wan was brought out by Mo Jingshan. The moment they stepped out of the living room, Jin Wan said, Don't worry about me. It's only 70 million. Not asking him to give me a price tag of 700 million is already the best outcome for me. Mo Jingshan looked at her and was silent for several seconds before saying, The 300,000 square meters of empty land near Ximin Square can be sold. Jin Wan. How did he know that she had this intention from the start? The man did not look at the astonishment in her eyes. He calmly said, The properties and land under your studio's name are all close to the city's planned public square. There are business opportunities everywhere. You've always been passionate about your studio, and your mind is clear. You know how to prepare well. Why would I worry? Seeing that her gaze was still slightly dazed, Mo Jingshan only caressed her hair. His tone was gentle and low. That piece of land was purchased by Han Tianyuan for 200 million a year ago. Right now, it's under your studio's name. In the past year, there hasn't been any opportunity to raise the price. Many people thought that this piece of land had fallen into their hands and was destined to lose money. Jin Wan raised her head from the man's face. You even know about such things. Is there anything about me that you don't know? Mo Jingshan raised her chin, his black eyes fixated on hers. His tone was casual and casual. I'm also thinking, is there anything about you that I don't know? Jin Wan felt a chill run down her spine from his gaze. Everything from her past life was still vivid in her mind. She raised her hand to touch her ear, avoiding his piercing gaze. Towards Mo Xiaozi's conditions, Jin Wan gladly accepted them. After all, it was one thing to be protected by Mo Jingshan and the elder, but it was another thing to have a chance to speak up in front of Mo Xiaozi. That's right. That piece of land had always been looked down upon. Back then, it was still in Han Tianyuan's hands. Because of that piece of land, he had a huge debt with the bank. Even now, the unsettled debt was still attached to her studio. Jin Wan kept delaying it, so everyone thought that she was unable to sell it. Do you know about the city plan that the city government has yet to release? Jin Wan asked. Mo Jingshan curved his lips. His smile was indifferent. I know. This isn't strange. The Mo Corporation has an inseparable relationship with Haicheng's business and political circles. But this city plan that had yet to be released, Jin Wan also knew that this was not logical. Mo Jingshan did not ask. He only looked at her. Jin Wan averted her eyes, saying seriously, The square will be rebuilt. The city hall's main building will also be moved there. All the land and buildings nearby will skyrocket overnight. Thus, Jin Wan had calculated clearly that within a week, she would be able to earn it all back. This was also within her original plan. While not disrupting her plans, she could also take the opportunity to bargain with Mo Xiaozi. It could be considered killing two birds with one stone. Seeing the faint flicker of light in her eyes, Mo Jingshan looked at her and said, Come here. Chapter 152. Mo Jingshan could tell that she was relaxed and confident. He held her waist and pulled her into his embrace. His words were low and carried a hint of warning. In the future, no matter what happens, don't run in front of me to block me. Remember this, do you hear me? Jin Wan smiled. In that situation, even if it was a knife, she would still rush over instinctively, much less a teacup. Mo Jingshan brought her back to the room and had the helper bring over some medicinal wine. He then had her sit by the bed and personally helped her massage the fist-sized bruise on her thigh. Jinwan looked at him asking, "Have you lived in Los Angeles for a long time?" Mo Jingshan's hand paused on her thigh for a moment, but it was only for the blink of an eye. He then continued to pour out the yellowing medicinal wine to massage her thigh. "When I was studying in America, I lived in Los Angeles. I stayed there for about 2 to 3 years. Jinwan stared at him. "Have we met?" Mo Jingshan stood up, closing the bottle of medicinal wine and casually placing it by the side. He turned back to look at her. "What do you think?" she said. The things that happened in America back then, her memories were really blurry. After all, so many years had passed in her previous life. How could she have the mood to recall her teenage years? Now that she thought about it, she could not remember when she had met Mo Jingshan. A man like him would leave a deep impression on any woman with a single glance. Even though Jinwan had grown up in the upper class and was used to seeing all kinds of outstanding men, if she had met Mo Jingshan before, she would definitely not forget him. "I don't think so," Jinwan muttered to herself. Mo Jingshan watched her, his gaze dark and deep. At the same time, in the Ji family's villa, it was already late at night. Ji Mengran's room was still brightly lit, but the atmosphere was stifling. Earlier, she had called in Shuyan. However, in Shuyan's tone was cold. "Second Miss Ji, you don't have to vainly hope to obtain any benefits from me. The relationship between us has never been one of cooperation. In the future, don't call me again." After that, the call was hung up. Originally, she wanted to use in Shuyan as a sharp blade to successfully push Jinwan away from Mo Jingshan's side. However, she did not expect that In Shuyan would return to America so soon. The reason she called her was to find out the current situation between Mo Jingshan and Jinwan. In the end, she heard such words that kept her 1,000 miles away. Clearly, this In Shuyan was the same as her, wishing for Jinwan to immediately disappear from this world. Yet, she insisted on pretending to be insufferably arrogant. Who was she showing her arrogance to? Returning to the United States was tantamount to retreating in defeat. As a loser, he pretended to be very virtuous. What surprised her even more was that Mo Jingshan's father's intervention failed to shake Jinwan's status as Mrs. Mo. If Jinwan was more suspicious, or if she was still as spoiled as before, she would definitely argue with Mo Jingshan. However, Jinwan had always been so calm. She did not even make a fuss once. Previously, Ji Mengran had always thought that Jinwan would definitely lose completely against a tough opponent like In Shuyan. However, right now, with this unexpected result, she really did not have any confidence. Not to mention that Jinwan's current personality was something she could not understand. Furthermore, with Mo Jingshan around, no matter what happened, it would be difficult to harm Jinwan. In front of the Mo family, Shine Group's chairman could not use too forceful methods to force her. After all, there was still the elder. Mo Xiaozi was sandwiched between Elder Mo and Mo Jingshan. There were many things that he could not do even if he wanted to. After all, the person standing by Jinwan's side was none other than Mo Jingshan. That man had a coldness that could cause one's bones to quench with fear. He did not make a sound, but it seeped into every corner. 2 days later, early in the morning, Ji Hongwen discovered that Ji Mengran appeared, as though she had not slept for several nights. Ever since she purposely targeted Jinwan at the Mo family, Ji Hongwen had been strict with her. However, it was clear that while he could control her, he could not control her heart. He abruptly said coldly, "You're eating with such a long face. Your father is still alive. Who are you crying for?" Ji Mengran was startled by the sudden words. She almost dropped the chopsticks in her hand. She raised her eyes to say, "Dad, I couldn't sleep for the past 2 nights. That's why. You can't sleep because you've done too many shameful things." Ji Hongwen coldly said. Ji Mengran secretly bit her lips. She endured the grievance and lowered her head to shove a mouthful of rice into her mouth. In the past, when Jinwan was at home, her father would often compare her with Jinwan, praising her for always accompanying him at home. He praised her for being gentle, knowing how to respect her elders, and for not going against him. His words were filled with praise for her, an instigation of Jinwan. But now, Ji Menggran unwillingly placed her bowl down. Under Ji Hongwen's glare, she had no choice but to pick it up and continue eating. However, the food was tasteless, and her stomach was filled with anger. Old Ji, don't blame Menggran. It's fine if you scolded her a while ago, but do you want to make things difficult for her for the rest of your life? Jinwan isn't an outsider. Both of them are your daughters. The Mo family's matter has been in the past for a long time. It's about time we move on, Shunharu gently persuaded. Ji Hongwen coldly scolded. Do you think you're very clean? Do you really think I don't know what happened when you took away the chessboard? Without your help, would Menggran have the ability to enter my study to take something? Shunharu smiled at him, as though she was begging for forgiveness. Her gaze then shifted to Ji Menggran, warning her not to cause any more trouble in front of her father. After finishing the meal under Ji Hongwen's cold gaze, Ji Menggran's heart was still burning with anger. While Ji Hongwen was at the company, Ji Menggran slipped out. She could not return to the Yu Garden, and she was unable to find out where Jinwan and Mo Jingshan were staying. The only thing she knew was that Jinwan's studio was in Jinlin Building. She decided to take a taxi there. Entering Jinlin Building, she arrived at the floor where Emonwan's studio was located. Seeing the words Emonwan's studio, Ji Menggran's expression was calm, but her heart was about to vomit. Just as she was about to enter, she was abruptly blocked by a tall, skinny, short-haired woman. Who are you? Ji Menggran was startled by this short-haired woman's cold aura. She took a step back, asking with a confused expression. Feng Ling did not speak, only coldly staring at her, not letting her in. Are you the receptionist of this studio or some small employee? You dare to block my way. Do you know who I am? Ji Menggran was extremely displeased at being ignored so coldly. Feng Ling expressionlessly cut her off. CEO Mo has instructed that the Ji family's second miss and dogs are not to approach within 10 meters of Mrs. Mo. Chapter 153. What did you say? Do you dare to say it again? Ji Menggran was enraged. Feng Ling's gaze was cold. As she wished, she repeated. The Ji family's second miss and her dog are not allowed to come within 10 meters of Mrs. Mo. You're so daring. Ji Menggran did not expect her to be so daring. She was so angry that she was about to throw her bag at her. In the end, the short-haired woman in front of her nimbly blocked her wrist. She then abruptly twisted it backward, almost breaking Ji Menggran's wrist. She cried out in pain. Ah! To prevent the noise from disturbing Jinwan, who was in the middle of a meeting, Feng Ling retracted her hand when Ji Menggran's face was pale from the pain. At the same time, she harshly pushed her 2 meters away. Scram! Feng Ling directly chased her away. Ji Menggran had just arrived, and was immediately given such a harsh slap at the door. She was so angry that her entire body was trembling. This woman was the bodyguard Mo Jingshan arranged for Jinwan? It was just a small matter that happened in the Mo family. And now Mo Jingshan actually did not even allow her to approach Jinwan. Exactly how precious was Jinwan? Did he need to protect her so carefully? Wasn't she just a vixen, who relied on the beauty of Haicheng's #1 socialite? Since you recognize me, you should know what kind of people the Ji family has in Haicheng. You actually dared to be so heavy-handed against me. I don't care who sent you. Do you believe that I won't sue you? Ji Menggran rubbed her wrist that was almost broken. The skin on her wrist was slightly red. She glared at the short-haired woman angrily. There has never been a bodyguard who dared to treat me like this. Feng Ling appeared as though she did not hear anything. She continued to stand there, maintaining her cold indifference. Ji Menggran did not believe her, and continued to walk forward. However, before she could approach, Feng Ling's cold gaze abruptly swept toward her. That gaze landed directly on Ji Menggran's reddened wrist, as though if she dared to take another step closer, she would really break it. Ji Menggran's expression did not soften, but her heart instinctively trembled. She paused and hesitated for a moment. Her gaze then turned toward the glass door of the studio. Feng Ling turned slightly to the side expressionlessly, blocking her view. She did not even give her a chance to look in. Although Ji Menggran was angry, she still kept her guard up. She didn't confront him head-on. She angrily turned around and walked out. Ever since she was slapped by Jinwon, Ji Mingran's heart was still somewhat fearful, and had not met Jinwon again. Previously, he had wanted to use the opportunity of An Shuyan coming to Haicheng from America to fan the flames, but in the end, he still did not gain any benefits. She wanted to see what was going on with Jinwon. Could it be that there really was an expert by her side giving her pointers? There must be something wrong with this. Boss Nwan, the leaders of the City Hall's land office have already gone to Ximen Square for an inspection. Xiaoba ran into Jinwon's office to report. Jinwon glanced at the time and stood up to pick up the car keys. Let's go take a look. Xiaoba held the prepared materials in her hands and followed Jinwon out of the studio. Just as Jinwon's car was about 100 meters away from the parking lot, a taxi followed behind. Ji Mengran sat in the car and said to the driver, "Follow them. Keep following them. Maintain a distance and don't get discovered." Ji Mengran then realized that Jinwon was acting strangely. Usually, Jinwon did not need to go to any social events. Her car was not heading in the direction of the U Garden, nor was it heading to the MO Corporation. Could it be that she was heading back to her new residence? Right now Jinwon was too guarded. Furthermore, they had already shed all pretense of cordiality. Ji Mengran could not brazenly approach her, and could only follow quietly, waiting for an opportunity to make a move. In the car in front, Feng Ling drove. At the same time, she casually glanced at the rearview mirror. The car suddenly sped up. Xiaoba sat in the front passenger seat and handed the materials in her hands to Jinwon. "Boss, these are the approval materials that we'll be showing to the land office's leader. Take a look. I've carefully sorted through them. There shouldn't be any problems." Jinwon took them and lowered her head to read them carefully, as though she was completely unaware of the situation behind the car. Feng Ling's driving skills were very good. She cleverly turned the car into the intersection on the side and quickly passed it. Although she drove very steadily, the sudden speed was too fast. Xiaoba, who was sitting in front, asked in confusion, "Why are you suddenly driving so fast?" Feng Ling did not speak. Her cold eyes were still indifferently glancing at the situation in the rearview mirror. Jinwon continued to read the materials in her hands without batting an eyelid. She did not make a sound, or even ask a question. Ji Mengran noticed that their car had sped up. Could it be that they had been discovered? Did Jinwon really have an unspeakable secret that she was afraid of being seen by others? Could it be that Jinwon was going to meet someone? Could it be someone that even Mo Jingxian didn't know? Ji Mengran threw another 200 yuan to the driver, ordering, "Chase after them." The driver received the money and stepped hard on the accelerator. However, no matter how fast a taxi was, it could not compare to Jinwon's Mercedes-Benz. It was left far behind, but the driver continued to madly chase after them. Jinwon's car did not stop even when it passed by Ximen Square. Xiaoba called out from the car, "Aya, we've arrived, we've arrived. Why aren't you stopping?" Feng Ling ignored Xiaoba's chatter and continued to speed up expressionlessly. After Jinwon finished reading the materials in her hands, she raised her head and said calmly, "Continue driving. Make a few more turns." Hearing this, Feng Ling's eyes immediately brightened. She followed her words and continued driving. This time she chose a remote road. The car took more than an hour on the road. When they left the studio, it was already past 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now it was 5:30 in the evening. The abandoned areas around High City that had been demolished for a long time were covered in dust. Every path was excessively dark. Ji Mengran increasingly felt that Jinwon must have something she could not tell anyone. Otherwise, she would not have driven so fast. She urged them to chase after them. When they neared the abandoned area, all of a sudden, Jinwon's car drove into the corner ahead. When the car chased after it, it could not be seen at all. Where did it go? The driver's expression was confused. There were 2 roads ahead, and it was impossible to tell which direction the car had gone. This place is filled with broken walls and tiles. The further in we go, the smaller the road becomes. No matter how agile that car is, it can't have gone too far, Ji Mengran said. I'll go in to take a look. Stop the car here and wait for me. After alighting from the car, Ji Minggran felt that Jin Wan was too strange. What was she doing here? Chapter 154. Ji Minggran took out her phone from her bag. She planned to take a picture of Jin Wan the moment she saw anything wrong with her, and bring it back to Mo Junction. However, even after walking for a long time, she did not hear any sound. The car could not drive in any further. Since the car did not come out, it could not continue driving in. Where exactly was it parked? The paths in the ruins twisted and turned, like a small maze. Ji Minggran walked in for more than 10 minutes before reaching the end of the road. The sky was getting darker and darker, and she felt uneasy. She turned around and started to walk back. Just as she was about to turn on the flashlight function on her phone to light up the road ahead, a tall and thin figure suddenly appeared from behind a wall and blocked her way. Ji Minggran was startled and froze in her steps. She raised her eyes to see that it was the female bodyguard who blocked her way outside the studio today. She immediately felt a chill run down her spine. Earlier in the parking lot, she did not notice that there was someone else in Jin Wan's car. From afar, she only saw Jin Wan's car being driven away and immediately followed. She did not expect this female bodyguard to be here as well. Ji Minggran quickly took a step back under Feng Ling's cold gaze. Minggran, are you following me? She had just taken 2 steps back when she abruptly heard Jin Wan's voice from behind. It was very close. Ji Minggran abruptly stiffened, her body trembled, and she almost did not have the courage to turn around to look at her. She then glanced at the female bodyguard before her, and finally realized that she had been played by Jin Wan. Feng Ling stood before her, and did not speak. She only had a cold smile on her face. As Ji Minggran froze in panic, and almost lost her grip on her phone, Feng Ling suddenly reached out, and harshly knocked on Ji Minggran's wrist. Ji Minggran's arm immediately felt numb and stinging pain. Her phone fell from her palm. Feng Ling quickly caught it, and casually slipped it into her pocket. What are you doing? Return my phone. Ji Minggran was shocked and rushed forward to snatch it back. However, how could she match up to Feng Ling's speed? The moment she rushed forward, the short-haired woman had already taken 2 steps back, causing her to almost fall to the ground. Ji Minggran forced herself to stand firm, suppressing the uneasiness in her heart. She thought for a moment and turned back. Seeing Jin Wan standing behind her with a calm and indifferent expression, she subconsciously tightened her grip. Seeing Ji Minggran's frightened expression, Jin Wan indifferently curved her lips. When she left the studio, she knew there was a car following her. She had heard from Feng Ling that Ji Minggran had gone to look for her during the day. She could guess that Ji Minggran must have been too suspicious, so she followed them quietly. Ji Minggran's thirst for knowledge was too strong. After chasing for so long, she didn't even consider if there would be any danger. She just kept following him like this. Jin Wan smiled coldly. You've been following me for so long. Have you found anything? Right now, Ji Minggran could no longer treat Jin Wan as the original Jin Wan. She cautiously and fearfully explained. Big sister, don't misunderstand. Dad said that you started your own studio, and was worried that you wouldn't be able to handle it, so he asked me to come over to help. In the end, I was blocked outside by your people. As she spoke, Ji Minggran cautiously glanced at the female bodyguard. Feng Ling coldly watched her. Ji Minggran's gaze faltered, and she rushed to face Jin Wan. Earlier on, I was near your studio. When I saw your car leave, I followed out of curiosity. After all, Dad said that he was worried that you'd lose all the money you've invested. He was also afraid that you'd meet with trouble in such a scheming business, and that you'd embarrass the Ji family. So I followed to take a look. Jin Wan crossed her arms, smiling mildly at her, but did not speak. Even though she knew how clumsy her excuse was, Ji Minggran could only force herself to continue. Even though the sky was dark and the wind was cold, Ji Minggran's body was already covered in cold sweat. A little sister who can't wait for me to embarrass myself in front of the Mo family. But now, just because of a few words from Dad, she specially came to show concern for me? Jin Wan raised her brows slightly, smiling. So, It turns out that Dad is worried that I'll embarrass him. It seems like I should give him a call tonight to have a good chat. I should at least give him some peace of mind." The moment she heard that she was going to give her father a call, Ji Mungran's expression immediately stiffened. "Big sister, I know that I was wrong about the matter at the Mo family. After Dad returned, he scolded me and locked me up at home for many days." Ji Mengran spoke as though she had been wronged. "If it weren't for Auntie Shin pleading for me, I might not have been able to leave the house until now. Please forgive me, okay? Besides, you didn't suffer any harm from that incident. After all, the two of us are blood-related sisters. Why do you have to keep harping on such a small matter?" Jinwon calmly watched her, her tone slowly dragging out. "Forgive? Just like when I was young, you secretly took my favorite dress to wear. After you dirtied it, you begged me to forgive you. But the next day, you refused to repent and continued to steal my other dresses?" Seeing that Jinwon could still bring up their childhood, Ji Mingran took the opportunity to say, "Big sister, we're blood-related sisters. We lost our mothers when we were so young. We grew up together, Enough." Jinwon had long lost her patience with her. "I don't have the mood to act like sisters with you." Ji Mingran's expression trembled. She knew that Jinwon really did not intend to give her any face. She directly shouted at her angrily, "Ever since you married into the Mo family, you've become completely arrogant, haven't you? First, you strangely forbade me from going to the U garden. Then you guarded against me time and time again. When I returned to the Ji family, you even targeted me. I was unhappy in my heart. That's why I wanted to embarrass you at the Mo family that time. Yet you still bear a grudge against me. Ji Mengran, your ability to be a thief-crying thief is really great." Jinwon lightly mocked. "Don't you know why I forbade you from going to the U garden?" Ji Mengran's expression did not change, but her gaze was guarded as she watched Jinwon. "Do you think that Mo Jingshan would read the messages you sent him? How many times do you think I've taken the medicine prescribed by that so-called psychiatrist? Do you think those little tricks of yours are so secretive?" Jinwon lowered her eyes and sneered. Ji Mengran was startled. Her lips moved, but she could not find any words to explain. Just like that, Jinwon approached her and looked at this so-called blood-related sister from a very close distance. Then, her lips revealed an unfathomable and cold smile. Chapter 155. Feng Ling nimbly pushed Ji Mengran behind the rubble. Without waiting for Ji Mengran to scream again, Jinwon expressionlessly turned to leave. Ji Mengran was heavily pushed against the stone wall. Her back hurt from the impact. Her face was pale and frightened as she stared at the short-haired woman in front of her. "I'm warning you, don't touch me. If you dare to do anything to me here, do you believe that I won't sue you? Even if I sue all 18 generations of your ancestors, they won't be able to rest in peace." Feng Ling coldly glanced at her. "I haven't even made a move. What are you screaming for?" Ji Mengran's face instantly turned red and white. Her hands gripped her clothes tightly, afraid that she would be beaten. She was so nervous that even her knuckles turned white. "Don't be afraid. Mrs. Mo doesn't intend to take your life." Feng Ling held back a cold smile. "But second Miss Ji, your thirst for knowledge is too strong. I can't possibly let you follow me for nothing. Since you're already here, don't be in a rush to leave." What do you mean?" Ji Mengran's lips trembled from the coldness in her eyes. Feng Ling took out Ji Mengran's phone that she had previously placed in her pocket. Ji Mengran glanced at it and reached out to snatch it back. "Return it to me." However, before her hand could touch it, the phone slipped from Feng Ling's hand. She could not catch it in time, and it fell heavily to the ground. Ji Mengran knew that something was wrong and rushed to pick it up. However, the phone was abruptly stepped on by Feng Ling's foot. The sound of the screen shattering could be heard from under her feet. Ji Mengran watched this scene, and her entire body turned cold. She slowly raised her eyes and resisted the urge to cry. Her body trembled as she stood up and leaned back cautiously. In an instant, she bumped into the stone wall behind her. "Do you know what this place is?" Feng Ling's tone was still cold. Ji Mengran subconsciously scanned the surroundings and answered guiltily, "This is a small area that was demolished a long time ago." Feng Ling was very tall and looked down at her. After so many years, no developer has come to rebuild it. Second Miss Ji, have you never heard of the reason? Ji Mingran's expression gradually changed from fear to alarm. She abruptly raised her eyes to look at Feng Ling. If she remembered correctly, this was a new neighborhood built a few years ago. Many people had successfully moved in, but not long after, there were rumors of hauntings and frequent strange occurrences, causing many people to quickly move out. Back then, the unscrupulous developers had occupied the unmarked graveyard area of High City from 100 years ago. However, after the baptism of time, many people had forgotten the original purpose of this land, so they bought houses here. But in the past, there were often rumors that this place was haunted, and no one dared to go near it. Later, because everyone moved away, and because the rumors of the strange incidents became worse and worse, the place was demolished. Until now, no developer dared to come and occupy this piece of land. Right now, the place they were standing on was the unmarked graveyard from 100 years ago, and the stone walls that had been torn apart. The weather forecast says it's going to rain tonight. Did Miss Ji bring an umbrella? Otherwise, if you stay here alone, it won't be good if you catch a cold from the rain. As Feng Ling spoke, she decisively snatched the bag from Ji Mingran's hands. She opened the zipper and turned the bag upside down, pouring all the things inside onto the ground. She then lowered her eyes to look at the various cosmetics and bank cards inside. She laughed coldly and casually kicked them a few times. She smiled faintly. You really didn't bring an umbrella. It seems like you can only be drenched by the rain. What do you mean I'll stay here alone? Ji Mingran's back was cold, and her lips were pale from fright. She could no longer care about the things in her bag. Not really alone. Feng Ling suddenly smiled coldly and evilly glanced at her. Tonight, perhaps many people will float out from the ground to accompany you. So, second Miss Ji, you don't have to be too afraid. What exactly do you want? I don't want to be here. Scram. Let me go. Ji Mingran was so frightened that all the hair on her body stood up. She screamed and reached out to push her away to escape. Feng Ling avoided her hand and grabbed her wrist, heavily pushing Ji Mingran back against the stone wall. This is the simplest warning. In the future, if you dare to follow Mrs. Mo again, I'm afraid it won't be as simple as being thrown here for a night. Feng Ling coldly said, Second Miss Ji, I hope you have a good time tonight. What are you doing? Come back. Give me your cell phone. Ji Mingran was afraid that she would really be thrown here. Right now, she had nothing in her hands, and it was impossible for her to hail a taxi in this area. She pounced over like a madwoman to grab her. In the end, she was mercilessly flung back by Feng Ling. She staggered backward and fell onto the ground. Several minutes later, Feng Ling returned to the car and said to Jin Wan, Mrs. Mo, we can leave now. Xiao Ba was still unclear of the situation, but seeing Jin Wan's cold and thoughtful expression, she did not dare to ask. When Feng Ling returned, she glanced at the time and softly said, Boss Wan, the people at Ximen Square should still be there. Are we still going? Yes. Jin Wan closed the documents in her hands. Let's go. Ji Mingran struggled to stand up with much difficulty. She walked forward step by step, wanting to return to the taxi she had taken earlier. However, the ruins were truly like a maze. She searched for a long time before she finally found it. However, the taxi had already driven away out of patience. The sky had already darkened completely. It was indeed raining at night, and the originally dark sky was now covered with dark clouds. Gusts of cold wind blew from behind her, accompanied by the sharp sound of the wind coming from the cracks in the dilapidated stone walls. Each sound was more terrifying than the one before. Ji Mingran was so frightened that her face was drained of all color. She frantically ran out, but even when she reached the wide road, she still could not see a single car passing by. This was originally the most desolate and abandoned place in Haicheng. Usually no one would pass by here. The highway to Haicheng was also not here, and very few cars would use this road. The moment she thought of how Jin Wan had purposely bypassed half of Haicheng just to bring her here, Ji Mingran hatefully yelled at the dark ruins. Jin Wan, just you wait. H. The surroundings were so quiet that there was not even a single echo. Only the sound of the wind blew from behind her. The cold rain landed on her face bit by bit. Jimengran was so cold that she hugged her chest tightly. She cautiously and fearfully turned back to look at the ruins that had been demolished. She had previously heard that this place was haunted. The various frightening things that happened late at night caused her legs to weaken. Chapter 156. After returning to Ximin Square, Jinwan successfully received the approval document from the National Land Office. Boss, since the surrounding land and housing prices are rising, should we sell off the properties nearby as well? Xiaoba asked. Jinwan sat quietly in the car, looking at the rain outside the window. She calmly replied, "Not selling." "Why?" "It's not easy to wait for an opportunity to raise the price. If we don't sell now, we'll suffer losses like before." Jinwan chuckled and glanced at Xiaoba. "You see, I've recently used the Mo Corporation's funds to purchase a few pieces of land that are extremely expensive. I'm so worried that I can't even sleep, am I right?" Xiaoba grinned, nodding her head. However, she still said, "But I believe in boss's intuition. Since you dare to do it, you definitely have your reasons. At least you know how to talk." Jinwan chuckled. She knew that she would definitely earn money, but she could not be too reckless. If she relied on her ability to predict the future and seized all the opportunities, she would only become the target of everyone else. In this ruthless business world, how many people became rich overnight? And how many people were immediately targeted by others? With every step, they would be hindered by their peers, as though they were walking on the edge of a knife. What Jinwan needed to do was to carry her ambition in this prosperous era and walk steadily step by step. Every share of the soup must be kept safely in her own pocket and would not be eaten away by any enemies. What she needed to do was to gradually develop the studio into a property brand company that belonged to her. Bit by bit, she would turn the funds in her hands into several times the profits. She needed to have the ability to support herself and the Ji family. She needed to do better and no longer need to be shielded by Mo Jingshan. What she needed to do was to be able to shield Mo Jingshan from the wind and rain one day. All of a sudden, Xiaoba pointed at the laptop on her lap, shouting, "Boss, look at the company's email. YJ Group said they want to buy the land beside Ximin Square. They offered 200 million yuan. They even sent such an official company email. That's 200 million yuan. Isn't this the same price that CEO Han bought it for? They actually didn't make a loss. Boss, how did you guess it? You're too amazing. When I received the documents earlier, I was worried that no one would accept your offer. But there really is someone who wants it." Jinwan raised her brows, speaking calmly. "Use the company's name to reply with an official email. Be polite and don't offend them. Tell them that we don't accept the price of 200 million yuan. If they are sincere, they can come to the studio to discuss with me. Why not? Previously, no one would buy that piece of land for less than 200 million. Now we can finally recoup our losses." "Boss, aren't you planning to sell it? Just do as I say." Jinwan calmly glanced at her. Xiaoba saw Jinwan's calm and composed expression. Although she didn't quite understand, her heart ached as if it was cutting her flesh. She was afraid that she would lose this rare opportunity to recoup her losses. But after all, Jinwan was the boss, so she had to do as she was told. Glancing at Xiaoba's sulky expression, Jinwan just smiled and didn't say anything more. In Jinwan's impression, 10 years later, the largest building complex in Haicheng's Ximin Square would be located on the land in her hands. The developer would be the country's famous real estate company, BGY Group. If history was not wrong, with BGY's accurate foresight, he would definitely not miss out on this prime location, and would definitely appear. The price would not be as simple as 200 million. After getting the approval documents, Jinwan naturally attended a dinner party jointly held by the City Hall and the business community. Today, Jinwan wore an off-shoulder nude evening gown. Her face was lightly made up. She was already attractive and right now, she was even more beautiful. Her lips were red, and her skin was fair. Beneath the gown was a pair of long, slender legs. She wore high heels, and her usual casual demeanor was gone. She exuded the charm of a little woman. For many years, she had always been so beautiful that people could not take their eyes off her. Tonight, she appeared here as the person in charge of the studio, and caused quite a stir. Firstly, it seemed that the eldest Miss G hadn't attended such a formal occasion for a long time. Secondly, after marrying into the Mo family, she had been keeping a low profile and rarely showed up. Last time, at the Mo Corporation and Shine's dinner party, she was carried away by Mo Jingshan. Although many of the people present hadn't seen the scene that night, they had heard of Mrs. Mo. Right now Mrs. Mo seemed to be very stable. Many people did not expect that Jin Wan would actually be able to stand firmly by Mo Jingshan's side. She was not even chased out by the Mo family. Most of Haicheng's wealthy young ladies hoped that Jin Wan would not be able to live well. However, things did not go as they wished. Jin Wan was as beautiful as ever. In fact, compared to the arrogant and bright her of the past, she appeared more composed and reserved. Her exquisite makeup hid her beautiful and aggressive appearance, and her low-key evening dress made her appear even more indifferent. She was beautiful, but she was no longer arrogant. Instead, she appeared cold and elegant. Apart from this, the female bodyguard by her side was also particularly eye-catching. "Mrs. Mo, I'll wait for you over there. If anything happens, I'll come over immediately." Feng Ling knew that it was not convenient for her to follow by Jin Wan's side. After sending Jin Wan over, she took her leave. Jin Wan had Feng Ling head to the resting area to eat something while she walked in alone. She ignored the gazes of the people around her and maintained a dignified and polite smile. However, she did not expect to meet Sheng Yihan in such a place. From afar, she saw the tall figure dressed in a suit. Jin Wan felt a lump in her throat. "What are you hiding from?" She walked away from the crowd and was about to go to the leaders of the National Land Office when she was interrupted by Sheng Yihan, who had approached her without her noticing. Jin Wan ignored him and did not respond. In the blink of an eye, she began to chat with several celebrities who used to be friends with the Ji family, trying to ignore Sheng Yihan's figure and the gaze he was casting at her. Seeing that she was deliberately avoiding him, Sheng Yihan smiled and was not in a hurry to go over. He waited until the celebrities left after exchanging greetings with her. Then he looked at the little woman, who turned around in the crowd and couldn't find other acquaintances. She couldn't help but look back at him. He looked at her snow-white neck and wrists. Unlike other socialites who wore all kinds of luxurious accessories, she was so clean that there was not even a simple thin chain or diamond watch. However, she was beautiful in her own way. Jin Wan remembered that at the Shine Group's dinner party, she had sat in his car because she was drunk. At that time, she was so angry that she was muddle-headed. Now, she tried to avoid him as much as possible and did not want to have any contact with him. She turned to quickly walk out of the crowd. However, because she turned too quickly, she accidentally bumped into a beautiful woman holding a glass of red wine. Chapter 157. Jin Wan usually did not pay much attention to the people at such banquets. However, when she saw the beautiful lady's face, her movements faltered. Her slightly apologetic expression immediately faded. This beautiful lady had once formed a grudge with her. She was the pearl of a furniture company, and her surname seemed to be Han. This Miss Han was once one of Mo Jingshan's pursuers. It could not be said that Mo Jingshan was not someone these people could easily meet. Especially after his marriage, these socialites who once had a crush on him, and even threatened to jump off a building just to meet him, could not even catch a glimpse of his back. This Miss Han, who had once appeared on Haicheng's news for almost jumping off a building for Mo Jingshan, was unconvinced by Jin Wan's title as the #1 socialite due to her beautiful appearance. She had tried to compete with Jin Wan several times at banquets, but was always coldly ignored by Jin Wan. As time passed, they began to dislike each other and formed a grudge. What angered her even more was that after Jin Wan married Mo Jingshan, she not only lost completely, but was also angered to the point of vomiting blood. Being able to meet Jin Wan again at such an occasion, Miss Han naturally would not miss out on the opportunity to nitpick. Although Jean Wan did not have much feelings for this Miss Han, when she saw the red wine stains on her gown, she lightly mocked. You're still holding the wine glass firmly in your hand, but the wine in the glass has spilled all over you. Do you need me to tell you how exactly you spilled it? Are you sure you want to use such a despicable method to frame me at a banquet between the political and business worlds? Miss Han's expression was unquenchable. What do you mean? You're still polite after knocking into me? This gown of mine was just ordered from overseas. Let's not talk about how expensive it was, but you ruined it the moment I put it on. Jean Wan was expressionless, but she did not wish to waste her energy arguing with someone like this. She calmly glanced at her and impatiently asked, So what do you want? Miss Han looked at Jean Wan arrogantly, and then glanced at the gown Jean Wan was wearing. She recognized that this gown was made by a famous designer in Paris and immediately said, Take off your gown. Wear it for me. Jean Wan slightly raised her brows. Are you sure? Originally, the commotion here was not loud, but because Miss Han had intentionally raised her voice, all sorts of unfriendly gazes were directed toward Jean Wan. There were many people who were on the same side as Miss Han. In Haicheng, there were many who were unconvinced by Jean Wan and could not bear to see Jean Wan marrying into the Mo family. Various wealthy young ladies saw this scene and approached to watch. Their gazes were all directed in Jean Wan's direction. They stood by the side and pointed, whispering, and their gazes were unkind. What's going on? Miss Lin, who had a good relationship with Miss Han, walked over and asked deliberately. Miss Han said unhappily, A certain Haicheng's #1 socialite is now crowned with the Mo family's name. She walks around with her eyes on the top of her head and doesn't even look at others. She bumped into me and caused my red wine to spill all over my body. In the end, not only did she refuse to apologize, she even became arrogant in front of me. Tell me, how can there be such logic in this world? She dirted my gown, and I have to bow and scrape to her on account of her status as Mrs. Mo? By the side, Miss Lin and the other wealthy young ladies all shifted their gazes toward Jean Wan. Facing a common love rival, they naturally stood on the same side. To be able to see Jean Wan make a fool of herself in front of everyone was naturally a joyous thing. Miss Lin spoke with a conciliatory tone. Since that's the case, then Mrs. Mo should apologize to Miss Han. After all, you've dirted her gown. Although your status is high, and the clothes you wear are many times better than ours, you can't look down on others like this. Is someone else's gown not a gown? If it's dirted, you have to apologize. A smile appeared on Jean Wan's face. Me apologize? Miss Han and Miss Lin stood before Jean Wan, but for some reason, they felt that their aura could not compare to Jean Wan's. They felt as though they were shorter in front of her. However, there were still many people watching by the side, and there were many who were unhappy with Jean Wan. Miss Han met Jean Wan's eyes and said, Earlier on, didn't you ask me how I want to resolve this matter? I've already said take off your own clothes. I'll let this matter go like this. Jean Wan tilted her head slightly, looking at her with a smile that was not a smile. Miss Han, you really don't care about trifles. Do you really like wearing clothes that others have worn? You don't have misophobia, but I have a very severe misophobia. I'd rather throw this gown into a shredder than allow others to touch my things. As she spoke, she paused for several seconds. Also, Miss Han, you only have 2 mouthfuls of red wine left in your hand. You're holding the glass so firmly. I only turned around and bumped into you. It doesn't even count as bumping into you. Such a small amount of wine actually spilled onto you, and you cleverly stained it in the most obvious spot. I can't even be sure if I actually touched the hand you used to hold the wine. Do you really have to make a big deal out of it? Could it be that you've contracted Parkinson's at such a young age? Your hands trembled to the point where someone only touched you slightly, and the wine in this glass spilled onto you? You. Miss Han instantly stared at Jean Wan in disbelief. She was so angry that her face was pale. She was clearly telling others that she was framing her and intentionally stirring up trouble. Right now, the one whose gown was dirted is me. Miss Han gritted her teeth in anger. Mrs. Mo, your face is really too ugly when you're trying to push the blame away. Am I pushing the blame away? If you can prove that this wine was indeed spilled by me, I'll immediately compensate you with a gown of the same style. But if you want me to take it off and give it to you, I'm afraid you're not qualified. Besides, Jean Wan's gaze calmly swept across her body. You're shorter than me by 5 centimeters, but you're clearly several kilograms heavier than me. Are you sure that even if I take it off, you'll be able to wear it? Jean Wan's speech was not fast, but there was no way for others to interrupt. The one who could not interrupt the most was naturally Miss Han. She was so angry that her hands were trembling. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.